Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothkushow.
Well, we're going to do a long form program as we did not have a show last week. We actually good timing for Constitution Day. I posted the first of 3 videos we did on site on September 11th in downtown Kansas City, Missouri. So be looking forward to 2 more coming out here in the near future. But as for today, we're going to do a long form program. I don't know, it might just go anywhere from an hour and a half to probably 90 minutes to 2 hours, just talking about a wide variety of issues currently going on right now. But I would like to think it's going to have, as far as where we're going to go with this, there will be there will be a synthesis to this. It will come together in, I think, a bigger narrative we're looking at. But I think we really need to start with this recent event, Iran being blamed for attack on a Saudi Arabian Aramco tanker, and obviously everybody's making noise. Everybody's got a lot of opinions about this. I don't know if anybody quite has any idea what's really going on with this, but obviously everybody is talking about it, both within the mainstream media as well as what we know as the alternative media. And we've been talking about it among ourselves. Jeremy, in a nutshell, what's your thoughts on this event and how it's shaping up after a few days?
There's so many overlapping different interests, such as what might factor into figuring out who had the motive to do this. But of course, motive is not, you still have to deal with forensics in terms of determining what actually happened and who did it. And motive, yes, can point you in the proper direction potentially, but it doesn't tell you everything. But the overlay of the tension right now and to me, this has the feel of a trumped up event of some sort, of some type
no pun intended.
No, yeah, well, obviously Trump is trumping it up, but there does have a sense of something that you might classify in the realm of a quote unquote false flag. And I would just first of all point to, and it's interesting that a lot of the alternative media doesn't even appear to be pointing this very obvious factor out, which is that just days ago, actually, the announcement of the run-up to the Saudi Aramco IPO, I think that stands for initial public offering, i.e. going public, bringing in lots of Wall Street money. And it appears that they were seeking an originating $2 trillion valuation in terms of their IPO. And Saudi Aramco, which is, I think it's largely a state-owned company, so thus it's under the control of Mohammed bin Salman in a de facto fashion, that they've decided to hand over the financial keys to the IPO to everybody you could name on Wall Street, it appears. And I think that JP Morgan was given the keys to head it up, although Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Citigroup, all potentially involved in this. And so then what you then deal with, not only in terms of the incentive of trying to drive potential oil prices up maybe in a short-term fashion in order to try to leverage pricing to drive the value of your IPO up. There's also the bigger factor of that the Saudi economy over the long term. It looks like that they are going to have issues in what is an inevitable transition of who knows exactly what time period from their oil-based economy to a more diversified economy. And so that's also been part of what we've been looking at especially during the Trump administration, is this increased ramp up. And this, of course, was pointed out in terms of why certain sectors were saying Mohammed bin Salman was a reformer, right? It was because he was allegedly trying to diversify the economy into a more quote unquote Western style economy, which includes things like tourism, but then also, as we've seen, this ramp up of the security sector. And so that, I think that's also in the deep background, is this question of unmeetable debts. I've read little bits and pieces there in terms of that if with oil prices where they sit now, that the Saudi government over the midterm will not be able to meet their spending obligations, basically their debt obligations. So that combined with this IPO, there is obviously some kind of indigenous incentive, you might say, in terms of an quote unquote inside job in Saudi Arabia, in terms of an alleged hit on these very major oil production sites. And so there's that aspect. Then I pop immediately into thinking, well, if there was inside incentive to stage something, then there would also be inside incentive to potentially not actually destroy. And what's so interesting is I have seen very recently that it looks like that they're saying that over 70% of the lost capacity is going to be returned online very, very quickly. And so then you want to look at what actually happened on the ground. And I've seen some very interesting photos that have been passed around and analyzed by people like John Young from Cryptome.org that makes it look like that the attack itself is actually just alleged and hasn't been proven in terms of the mass destruction that's being said that actually happened there, and that something maybe more minimal or more targeted and or maybe being something that's more regular, such as a pit of burning oil, has been being presented as if it were some type of attack. But meanwhile, you still have the question of the Houthis some aspect of the Houthi leadership has apparently claimed responsibility for it. I haven't checked all of that. I have seen things about how there was chatter that some aspect of the Houthi leadership had somehow been working with some Saudis in relationship to this, and so I haven't tracked all of that down. And then meanwhile, you have the question of Iran. Iran is being fingered by people like Trump and Pompeo. And Trump hasn't directly, I don't believe Trump has publicly directly fingered them, but Pompeo apparently has. And Trump seems to be implying publicly that he said we're locked and loaded and ready to go.
That's his go-to line whenever you rattle against.
Yes. And so it's hard to know exactly to think of all of this. So there's a lot of players, and of course Israel is deep in the mix. Today is not only Constitution Day in the United States of America, but it's also the election day in Israel, and the prime minister Netanyahu. There's always all kinds of stuff that he's doing, staging provocations, promises of hardline policies such as annexing the West Bank areas, as he's talking about, or this. Then there was an apparent Islamic Jihad rocket attack on close to his campaign event, where they then ran off stage, and all of this kind of stuff, along with the very interesting and continuation of the American involvement in such political propaganda as people like Jack Posobiec, highlighting once again saying that the Iranians hacked into Benny Gantz, one of the opponents of Netanyahu. We've talked a little bit about him. He's interesting. He has a background with, of course, technology companies. I believe he has a background with a technology company directly tied to Victor Vekselberg, who we maybe will touch on later, who's also directly tied into Carbine 911, which is this Epstein epicenter, Ehud Barak, Michael Chertoff, Peter Thiel, even Trump supporters are in the mix there. Lital Leshem, which along with Eric Prince, works in relationship to Frontier Services Group. That's a China connection. So there's a lot right there. And so that people like, Jack Posobiec have been emphasizing that the Iranians have compromising information on Benny Gantz from a hack that they did. And, so that's the same thing that last time he was saying. So I find that pretty interesting. And there's a lot of people that seem to line up when, it's election time for Netanyahu. And I would once again point out that there is this similarity between Trump and Netanyahu, and that they're facing issues of corruption, legal implications in terms of corruption. And that is obviously where Trump is most openly vulnerable, is in terms of violations of the Emoluments Clause. And the stories just compound in terms of the use of the office of the presidency of the United States of America, in terms of the Trump operation, the Trump organization, in terms of enriching themselves. And that we've pointed out that in terms of the old school shorthand of how you create an asset, MICE, money, ideology, compromise, and ego, that really it's the bookends of that, the money and the ego, that seem to be sort of like the things that you could hold down Trump as your asset, even if he's not totally normalized and dependable, as we've hypothesized at time. So both Netanyahu and Trump are incentivized politically to stave off political and legal proceedings domestically that could potentially put them into situations where they might even face serious legal repercussions for their corruption. So that is all happening in the same time. And meanwhile, the question of Russia, how is Russia involved here? And Russia apparently has now stepped up to offer the Saudis some air defenses. I think even before this alleged attack, that there was that the Saudis were said to have been seeking the S-400 from S-400 anti-aircraft defense systems from the Russians. And I guess the S-400s is apparently effective in relationship or specifically in relationship to stealth technology. And so that's also been put up there.
I find this interesting in that the couple of times we've ever seen Putin and it seems that the interactions have been, I believe there was one interaction, I believe was actually I picked up on this of Putin having
posted
what
where
appeared to be.
It cut out when you said what had been posted.
I'm sorry. I forget where this was posted. RT or one of the Russian media outlets I forget what summit it was, but there was a summit. Both Putin and MBS were in attendance, and they both, they seem to have a fairly good camaraderie between them. And so, in the light of that, you don't hear much about Russia's angle on the whole MBS, the rightful global outrage over the excesses of the Saudi leadership under the Crown Prince, I guess soon to be King Mohammed bin Salman. But this whole discussion of Russia reaching out to Saudi Arabia as a weapons provider, this could seem to me, in a way, if you think about the outrage over U.S. Support of MBS to the point where you've had so much pressure from Congress on Saudi Arabia, and even Trump allies like Lindsey Graham publicly questioning the continued U.S. Relationship with Saudi Arabia under MBS. And so it's interesting if this pushback continues and there were to be some type of major severing or major crack or break in the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, it appears that perhaps, just like we've seen so many other times, Russia might be there waiting in the wings to fill that void. So we'll see if that's the case with this. I mean, although the Trump administration very much has a vested interest in keeping alive this relationship with MBS, that I would say a very large portion of the U.S. Washington D.C. establishment, foreign policy establishment, is very much opposed to. So it appears to me that we could be setting the stage for Russia to come in and pick up the pieces and maybe become perhaps one of the primary funders or protectors in terms of providing various services to the Saudis in the wake of all of this. We'll see. That's something to look out for down the road, I guess. And
I would point out that I mentioned that Seth Abramson, maybe a couple shows back, I mentioned that Seth Abramson had put out this book, Proof of Conspiracy, how Trump's international collusion is threatening American democracy. And the entirety of that book is really a practice of curatorial journalism, where he goes over thousands of stories of journalism worldwide and points out what the actual structure of the Trump collusion operation really was, the 2016 election operation, what we've sometimes shorthanded it as the 11/9 other side of the 9/11 operation. And of course, the deep aspects are one place where Abramson leaves a lot to be desired. That includes things like September 11th, which we see as a key point in terms of understanding the networks that are potentially involved here behind using Trump as an asset. Very, very possibly. But even then, in terms of the question of election operations, especially in the United States, I've read that supposedly the Israelis, they do hand-counted ballots with all of the political, representatives of the different political factions and parties as all at the table when the counting is going on. And so apparently they don't have to worry about things like the kind of election fraud that has very likely defined the nature of the United States democracy or electoral system, let's say, at the very least from the 2000 to the present, in a severe fashion. And we've dealt with aspects of that and how it even ties in relationship to things like how Paul Manafort, who was not only at the epicenter of the Trump campaign in 2016, but in terms of his work in the Ukraine, had been working with Rove's IT guru, Mike Connell, who was at the epicenter of apparent machine rigging, election fraud, in relationship to the Rove network. But Manafort was utilizing Connell's service also, even in Ukraine, apparently. So that's another area where I believe that Abramson, you're not going to find what you probably need to know about how the 2016 operation was actually likely pulled off. And yes, you have these information operations, you have these social media, psychological warfare operations that surround such companies as Cambridge Analytica, people like Steve Bannon, but also the involvement of Russian intelligence services, Israeli intelligence services, Israeli cutouts in terms of Joel Zemel and Psy Group, and that whole aspect. But when it comes down to it, it's similar to, like we've talked about, that 9/11, you have a tripartite structure of the way that you're going to pull off an operation like that. Yes, you're going to have intelligence operations surrounding it, including the construction of the legends of the patsies and the placement of the patsies and the blaming of the patsies. Then you're going to have the counterintelligence operation, which is the cover up or the subterfuge after the fact in many ways. The smoke screen after the fact to muddy the waters of the investigation into it, including direct cover-up of disinformation. But then ultimately you have a military operation. You're going to guarantee, for example, on September 11th, that that buildings are going to be struck and buildings are going to be taken down and areas of buildings are going to explode. That you're not going to leave in the hands of your intelligence assets patsies to hope that they're going to do hijackings and strike their targets. Similarly, I would assert, in terms of an 11/9 election operation, such as what the Donald Trump operation represents, yes, you're going to have your intelligence operations, you're going to have your social media, mass psych warfare, mass MK Ultra, your from an Israeli perspective, your consciousness operations, your CONOPS. But then meanwhile, and of course that's all in the realm of things usually like something like civilian intelligence operations, like CIA, Mossad, FSB, or something like, or not FSB. I forget what the in Russia the human services. I forget the acronym for them, but or MI6, for example, in the UK. But you're then going to have military operations be locked down to guarantee that you're going to see the ultimate effect, the ultimate physical effect also, because that's one way you could describe what you're doing in relationship to things like election machines, is you're actually guaranteeing an actual number that's going to be displayed in physical reality in terms of who's going to be elected. And so that is another piece that's lacking there with Abramson. And I think that there should be some more effort put into nailing that aspect down, the election fraud potential aspect of the 2016 election. We did an interesting long panel on the election fraud in 2016 on No Lies Radio. I believe that video is no longer up on YouTube. But that was a very interesting panel that began to address these issues in a way that I haven't really seen this talked about in public, in audio or video. I've seen little bits here and there on Twitter and a little bit of writing here and there. But that panel, which was Bob Petrakis, Mark Crispin Miller, and Jonathan Simon, who wrote key book Code Red, dealt with some of the aspects that point to 2016 election fraud, including precedent from before. But so just wrapping up in terms of back to Abramson, what he does really well, though, is to point out, although he doesn't lock down the actual military operation, I would say, behind a lot of this, and the longer term deep operations such as September 11th and what that says about this current moment, he does better than almost anyone, I would say, actually put together the framework based on open source journalism of who the players are in terms of the motive and some of the intelligence operations that were put into place in relationship to the Trump operation. And that is very much described as the Red Sea conspiracy that draws together. I think he calls it bruise. Let me see. Let me see that real quickly.
Okay.
Yeah, I think he's really saying it's Bahrain, Russia, UAE,
Saudi
Israel,
Arabia.
Saudi Arabia, Egypt. And he references a story that came out just last year on Middle East Eye, actually, that actually talks about a yacht, a meeting on a yacht that is the epicenter of some of this actual agreement behind what we're now actually seeing. Okay, I'm just going to read real briefly here. It's the very beginning of the introduction of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, "The Red Sea Conspiracy and the Grand Bargain. In late 2015, after Donald Trump has formally announced his candidacy for president, a geopolitical conspiracy emerges overseas whose key participants are the leaders of Russia, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt. These 6 men decide that Trump is the antidote to their ills. For Russia, U.S. sanctions. For Israel, the lack of Arab allies. For Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt, perceived threats emanating from Iran. The conspirators commit themselves to doing whatever is necessary to ensure that Trump is elected. Trump's presidential campaign is aware of and benefits from this conspiracy both before and after the 2016 election. On March 19, 2018, British journalist David Hirst, the former chief foreign leader writer for The Guardian, publishes the most important report of his career. Hirst, at one time the Moscow bureau chief at The Guardian, is now editor-in-chief of his own publishing venture, a London-based Middle East watchdog called the Middle East Eye. In the spring of 2018, he reports the existence of a years-long, continent-spanning conspiracy that will eventually envelop the President of the United States, the Red Sea Conspiracy. This book denominates the conspiracy Hirst uncovers as the Red Sea Conspiracy, for the simple reason that it is hatched on a yacht in the middle of the Red Sea, a seawater inlet of the Indian Ocean bordered by, among other countries, Saudi Arabia and Egypt. One imagines that in his many years as a correspondent and commentator for The Scotsman, The Huffington Post, Al Jazeera, Qatar, Al Arabi, Al Jadid, England, TRT World, Turkey, Masr al-An, Egypt, and The Guardian, Hirst never thought he'd stumble on a story as far-reaching in its implications as the Red Sea Conspiracy. But he did, and what he found could change the course of history. And I could read a little bit more so people get a sense of what's actually being alleged here or put forth here. But I would just also point out that the other piece of the aspect that I think that Abramson really misses too is how strong the domestic element here. So he does, of course he deals with domestic elements in American citizens and people such as Eric Prince or Bannon or Nader or Manafort or these kinds of people. But because of his either lack of interest or lack of background in deep American politics or deep American history, he does not actually, is not able to put forth that this is not just sort of primarily a foreign conspiracy, that there is a continuity of elements that really reach way back in terms of domestic operations here that's also being fulfilled.
In a lot of ways, and on multiple avenues, multiple areas, the domestic interests, I think, are just as important as the in many ways, obviously obviously there's a huge intersection there as well. And I know you mentioned in the book that just by, I guess, from quickly looking through the book, that Seth Abramson has a chapter on the Center for the National Interest, which of course is I almost call it the Russia lobby in the United States, with many figures being in executive positions, board positions, leadership positions at CNI. And he also mentioned even Project Veritas, James O'Keefe's organization, as being basically mentioning that organization as a domestic operation going on. But there's much more to it, and I think that I think also there's the factor of, I think that some of the things that obviously that Abramson might be missing is the historical nature of these long-term operations, and even just going even beyond what Whitney Webb's put out in terms of Roy Cohn, and going back to the history of Meyer Lansky and the obvious mob aspects of it, which very much, I think, at the forefront, certainly with people like Meyer Lansky, see the Israeli there's a lot of intersecting between long-term, Soviet interests, but also even and I think so much of the nature of these deep, operations, and in many jurisdiction of the federal government,
deep what? Sorry, what did you say? Deep something?
Sorry,
cut out.
these deep, secretive, covert operations that I think go outside of, and or even in some cases, some of the domestic DC, as we know them, intelligence services, and the long-term history of working with domestic operations such as the, elements of the John Birch Society, the World Anti-Communist League, and then even the continuation of this being in so many ways, a continuation of the Reagan era operations that were going on both domestically and internationally, with a lot of interchange among it. So I think that when you mention that, that's some of the history there that I think that there's some work to be done when it comes for the understanding Seth Abramson and others. So.
Yes, and I will just read a little bit more from that introduction, but you referenced I think it's chapter 2, so I just want to do reference chapter 1, which we briefly discussed before we started recording. The title is The Pedophile, The Mercenary, and the Flak. And you were able to get 2 out of these 3 without me telling you.
Yes.
So props on that. And so it turns out that the pedophile is George Nader. The mercenary is Eric Prince, and the flak is Elliot Broidy. So I'm just going to read the opening, the sort of intro, sort of summary of this chapter, and then I'll move on to the second chapter, which you referenced, that talks about the CNI. Okay, quote, as future Trump advisor, this is page 22 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, as future Trump advisors George Nader, Eric Prince, and Elliot Broidy established deep Israeli and Arab ties, Trump and his son-in-law Jared Kushner engage in a series of suspicious business transactions with foreign nationals, and Paul Manafort begins years of work for pro-Kremlin interests. The Kremlin's intense focus on connecting with Trump advisors during the 2016 election underscores foreign nationals' ongoing interest in pursuing relationships with Trump and those close to him both before and after his entrance into presidential politics. And Elliot Broidy is an interesting figure here because he has this very deep background in relationship to Israeli technology and finance. So that should be looked into. And I want to say, by the way, that it turns out that Elliot Broidy is or was on the board of the Wilshire Boulevard Temple in Los Angeles, California, where I had my bar mitzvah. I believe that was probably 1991. I remember it being surrounded by the first Gulf War, actually. And I just read this recently in terms of Broidy's involvement at Wilshire Boulevard Temple. So I just wanted to mention that. And people can go look at his background in terms of his investments, not only as a Republican political operative and financier, but really deep into the heart of Israeli finance and technology.
And he was also finance chair of the Republican National Committee during an important period, 2005 to 2008. So during the Bush administration, when there was a lot of drama and intrigue regarding Iran policy, even to the point to the very much a civil war of some sorts broke out within the administration of where the direction of the would head. And so Elliot Broidy was period. So I find that
Elliot Broidy was what? It cut out when you started saying that.
I'm sorry, the Finance National Committee during the second half of the Bush administration.
Okay.
So.
All right. So chapter 2, which you reference, is titled, this is page 61 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, the Iran nuclear deal, the Center for the National Interest, and the Valdai Discussion Club, 2013 to 2014. Shortly after Trump decides to run for president, the Kremlin begins its covert election interference campaign. Tensions in the Middle East rise as Russia and a large alliance of Western nations sign a nuclear deal with Iran that both Israel and the Saudi-led Sunni axis in the Gulf strongly oppose. Two men with Kremlin ties who will have a profound effect on Trump's 2016 campaign, Dimitri Simes and Joseph Mifsud, make visits to a prestigious discussion venue in Moscow, of which Vladimir Putin is the chief patron. And then it also talks about it very early on here references that infamous campaign video that Trump recorded on behalf of Benjamin Netanyahu, and talks about his discussions with Roger Stone in early 2013, or actually on January 1st of 2013. But I think the Dimitri Simes we've touched on a little bit before in terms of some of our discussion of the Center for the National Interests and his role there, and it looks like he has gone back apparently to Russia, which is very strange because I think he's been in the United States for a long, long time, and that's part of what of the articles that we reported upon is that he's been here a long, long time, and so then he's rushing back to Russia to work for state-sponsored television. What's going on with that? Joseph Mifsud, yes. This other character we haven't really touched upon, and I think it is complex about who exactly he is and what his intelligence background actually represents.
Yes, indeed. And real quick on Simes, I mean, we've mentioned this before, but I wanted to point out again how Simes came with his family to the U.S. in the early 70s, which is right at the beginning of the Jackson-Vanik era, following the amendment which allowed for the immigration of Soviet Jews out of the Eastern Bloc, the Communist Bloc. And it's been said that among other people who Dimitri Simes had formed relations with upon coming to the United States was none other than Robert Kagan, the arch, in many ways, one of the godfathers of the neocons, particularly as it relates to the old Scoop Jackson Democratic hawk crowd. So just wanted to throw that in there. And there's a lot more that can be done on Dimitri Simes. We talked about him in depth but I just wanted to reiterate that and throw that in there as it might relate to this bigger historical narrative that we've been trying to untangle regarding this Richard Pearl network of operatives going back at least to definitely really taking major influence in the Reagan era. So, and
maybe we will in this longer discussion here, maybe we will touch on some of the aspects that are very convoluted in relationship to the war on terror, the global aspect of the war on terror, as we've really pointed at before, in terms of the major powers of the planet are obviously all on board together, or at the very least certain commanding heights of these major powers, such as the United States, and that relationship with Israel, but also the large aspects of Europe. But then we've also talked about how China and Russia, who are supposed to be the actual nemeses, sometimes seen as actual threats or potential enemies in a potential military competition moving forward. Neither one of them, in terms of China and Russia, really protested the war on terror, really, in any significant fashion. And in fact, they fully embraced it, utilized it, are part of it, and especially have embraced the technological surveillance aspect of it.
In the case of China, I think it's there's some examples, but I think with Russia in particular, I think the support for the bigger idea of the war on terror is much more profound and much more obvious. I mean, even going in the way that spoken about ISIS, the whole idea of annihilating ISIS off the face of the earth, and basically coming into, I don't know if Russian governments use that directly, but there have been, that's a common talking point you'll hear among, say, perhaps among pro-Russian some of the alternative media. George Galloway of the UK, who's very much of Russia being a threat that really is nothing that we should be worried about. And so the way the framing that comes in from this of basically cleaning up America's messes and destroying radicals that the West creates, that I would say it's very obvious that from Russia not only is not really trying to counter, in my view, based on what I can see, not really trying to counter U.S. aggression as far as the post 9/11 world goes, but actually aids in the promoting of the idea of the war on terror as a mechanism. And I think this can be seen through, in some ways, even through the presidential candidacies of people like Tulsi Gabbard. I think this very much becomes, I think it's pretty clear when you really take a look at it. So.
Yeah, and so a lot of that gets lost in this alleged anti-war conception of anti-regime change wars, and way beyond just, as we pointed out over and over and over again, that the obvious difference that seems to hook directly into the 1996 clean break paper of people like Richard Pearl, right, the Feith, the Wormsers, etc., for incoming Netanyahu, that it explains the difference that Syria very potentially, at the very least in terms of the interests that were outlined in that paper, and apparently in terms of reality, that Syria was not meant to be a regime change war. It was meant to be a rollback war, a destabilizing war of some sort, and that Iraq was the regime change war, and that those words are very, very obviously found in the clean break paper. And so when Tulsi Gabbard just sort of uses this umbrella terminology of she's against the regime change war, but then she still hasn't really dealt with the statement that she made about she's a dove on regime change wars, but she's a hawk on the war on terror. That the war on terror is the big one, and it's ongoing. And yes, I would point out that these things, these so-called regime change wars, that includes wars that have not changed the regime, such as Syria, are part of the ongoing thing that is called the war on terror.
Absolutely, and once again, we've said this, and I'm sure we'll continue to say it as long as we have a platform, that this here by those who are pushing pushing back.
This what? What did you say? This what?
This narrative that's in place by those who are pushing, said to be the ones pushing back against the American U.S. aggression in the war on terror and U.S. regime change. Not only does it aid the narrative of the bigger line of the war on terror, but it's directly based on a lie that Muslims were responsible for attacking us on September 11th. And that's the big lie that gets kept alive regardless of if we're talking about the U.S. establishment or we're talking about the Russia-friendly establishment. There may be some outliers within, the alt media who are more or less honest about September 11th, but in general, you're not getting that. And this is the reason, I think, the primary reason why this war on terror narrative is able to even stand from this perspective of challenging, the U.S. and the U.S. role post 9/11 world. So
yes, and we will then deal with some of this aspect. I think it's not only Russia that is so obviously a vocal member of the pro-war on terror international community, as you rightly pointed out, in terms of the rhetoric that from Putin to the George Galloways of the world to the Tulsi Gabbards, really too, that the rhetoric of the war on terror seems to align. But China is very much also has embraced this, especially in terms of what we already referenced obliquely in terms of the Eric Prince network. The Tal Leshem is part of this Carbine 911. People need to read Whitney Webb's long article about the Israeli background of things like the Main Corps in the United States, the continuity of government planning via the Oliver North crew that now Alex Jones has apparently embraced in the day and age of the Donald Trump so-called patriotic administration. That in the background there, that's now being perfected in terms of the elements of the 9/11 perpetrators in the 21st century, and as I hypothesize, this intense question of the technology incentive of September 11th, even potentially beyond the geopolitical regime change wars, the regime rollback wars, all of those wars that are part of the destabilization operations that are part of the incentive of the post 9/11 world and 9/11 as an attack itself. But this perfection by the 9/11 perpetrators themselves of the technology component, of the surveillance grid component, and is really crucial. And so go look at Whitney Webb's latest article about Carbine 911 and Main Core and the Epstein, Ehud Barak, Lital Leshem, Michael Chertoff, Peter Thiel, the Trump supporter network, and Victor Vexelberg in the middle of all of that. So China really their involvement in all this really can be seen so obviously in relationship to their technological embrace of the war on terror, including this direct connection of Frontier Services Group, Lital Leshem and Eric Prince, in terms of their quote unquote Uyghur Muslim problem, right? And potential concentration camps that could very credibly be titled that, and the usage of pervasive digital technology to create one of the most high, even way beyond, I think, the UK, that's been pointed out how many cameras there are, closed circuit cameras there are in post 9/11 United Kingdom. China, and in terms of their attention to their quote-unquote Uyghur Muslim problem, has really shown what the future is meant to hold if the war on terror, so-called, if the hawks on the war on terror are allowed to continue this march towards technological tyranny, rather than us rooting out and holding to due process judicial account the treason of things such as September 11th. And then wrapping up, maybe then we also then need to add to the mix this question of how did people like Vladimir Putin come to power in the run-up to September 11th and assert himself as a war leader in relationship to things like civilian apartment bombings that were then utilized as a way to justify a war into Chechnya in relationship to their Chechen, quote unquote, Chechen Muslim problem. So this is a very big deal here. And this, of course, is what's missing behind the Abramson analysis of the 11/9 operation. But he creates the framework for understanding the 11/9 operation on the surface, that especially if we combine it with what we know about the analysis of the technological tyranny incentive, the epicenter of Israeli military intelligence, Talpiot program, in the middle of all of that, but then also the history of deep politics and 9/11, the assassinations, the precursor bombings in an American context, and even more globally in terms of embassy bombings in Africa, and then also in the wake of September 11th and other bombings around the world that appear to be part of a network of operations that very likely that the Trump operation itself, which is not just a Trump operation, very obviously, that this is a authoritarian network of some sort that is after some kind of political change that has to do with, a relationship to the so-called quote unquote liberal world order that people like Robert Kagan are now, really intensely, even, publicly debating the current Israeli leadership, in order to defend in the pages of the Washington Post. And maybe we should talk about that a little bit, more. But that, yes, this is a global network. And I just want to finish off this Middle East aspect as Abramson portrays it in Proof of Conspiracy. Okay,
please do.
Back to page 2. Quote, "This book chronicles the events around the globe that preceded and followed the fall 2015 origin of the conspiracy, with a special focus on how the conspiracy prompted Donald Trump and his aides, allies, and associates to covertly collude with 6 countries both before and after the 2016 presidential elections: Russia, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, Bahrain, and Egypt. Events that began on the Red Sea in 2015 now influence President Trump's foreign policy toward all of these countries, toward other countries not involved in the conspiracy, such as Qatar and Iran, and more broadly toward Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. The story of the Red Sea conspiracy begins with a man named George Nader. As reported by Hearst in the Middle East Eye, toward the end of 2015, Nader, then an advisor to the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, known as MBZ, convened with his patron's permission a summit of some of the Middle East's most powerful leaders. Gathered on a boat in the Red Sea in the fall of 2015 were Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS, Deputy Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who would shortly become the heir apparent to the throne of the Saudi Kingdom. MBZ himself, by 2015, the de facto ruler of the United Arab Emirates, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the president of Egypt, Prince Salman bin Hamad, the Crown Prince of Bahrain, and King Abdullah II of Jordan. Nader, the improbable maestro of these rulers' clandestine get-together, intended the plan he posed to the men to include the nation of Libya, but no representative from that nation attended the gathering. Of the leaders aboard the yacht, two, MBS and MBZ, are already close. According to a New Yorker interview with Richard A. Clarke, a counterterrorism advisor to Presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush, and unquote, an aside here, and fingered by such people as former member of the National Security Council, Gwyneth Todd, as being a credibly accused suspect in the midst of September 11th. But putting that aside, and of course that's those kind of asides that are critical to what's missing from Abramson's political analysis, let alone his narrative. But back to the text here. Page 3 of Proof of Conspiracy by Abramson, that according to a New Yorker interview with Richard A. Clarke, a counterterrorism advisor to Presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush, MBS and MBZ, quote, talk on the phone all day to each other, unquote. The Red Sea meeting, though technically convened by Nader, is a means for MBZ to advance ambitions that he and MBS have designed together. The two Sunni Arab leaders' intention, Hearst records, is to remake the Middle East with the covert assistance of a highly placed American politician. They intend to do this by first renaming and reconstituting the membership of the six-member Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC, which in 2015 comprises Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar, while reorienting, too, its regional ambitions and global alliances. The proposed GCC realignment would evict Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar from the Council and replace these three countries with Egypt, Jordan, and Libya, thereby eliminating the entity's historical association with the Persian Gulf and remaking it as, instead, an alliance constituting, quote, an elite regional group of 6 countries, which would supplant the GCC and form the nucleus of a coalition of pro-U.S. and pro-Israeli states, unquote, in the Middle East. According to two sources briefed on the 2015 Red Sea Summit, quote, Nader said this group of states could become a force in the region that the United States government could depend on to counter the influence of Turkey and Iran. And there's more, unquote, from the book, and there's more here, but I'll just leave it there for now in terms of the general architecture of this Gulf aspect of this, which I believe should be taken into account in relationship to what the incident in Saudi Arabia and what all of that might mean and what it might be motivated by.
Certainly, and thank you for that. And we'll definitely, as we look more and more through Abramson's book and through other in the future, we will certainly continue to zero in. And I guess in the last, maybe I don't know how much longer we can go here. We have a couple more things we want to get into. Jeremy, you did an interview. Is this where you want to go next? Would you like to go to the interview you conducted for local public radio station here in Kansas City with Richard Silverstein of the Tikkun Olam blog?
Yes, because I think that his reporting and perspective and analysis of what's going on here in terms of Israel and Saudi Arabia, and also the role of Russia in terms of this relationship with Iran, I think would be really helpful to factor in right now, because especially when thinking about this question of everyone's looking at this apparent contradiction on the surface of Russia being an ally, apparent ally, and benefactor of Iran, while also now saying that they are going to help defend Saudi Arabia, while elements are accusing Iran of attacking Saudi Arabia, that they are obviously seen more and more, at the very least seen, as the moderator of this theater. And so that question of theater, especially in relationship to war, I think is what we might want to pay attention to here, and I will play this edited interview. And maybe what we'll do eventually is post the unedited interview I did with Richard Silverstein, because it actually touches upon the Trump Tower meeting that included Psy Group Zamel and UAE and Saudi Arabia representatives, and also then he delves into the background of Elliot Broidy and relationship with Dennis Ross and the Washington Institute for Near East Policy that wasn't immediately relevant to this community radio show, which is mainly more about Israel-Palestine, but might be really of interest to our community and our audience. So, all right, I'll play this, and let me know if it's not if you can't hear it, and I'll try to move it a little bit closer, Greg.
Okay, sounds good.
This is Jeremy Roth-Kushel. I am very happy today to be joined with Richard Silverstein. Richard Silverstein is an incredible journalist and analyst. I want to get into your most recent breaking story. The headline is "Breaking: Israeli Missile Cruisers Patrol Yemeni Coast as Israel Hezbollah Exchange Rocket Fire on Border," is very instructive around the escalation of tension in the region. Will you give us a quick breakdown of what you've been learning?
Sure. Some of the stories that I report, I'm basically just going through the Israeli Hebrew language media and stories that don't get to the foreign press. So that's an example of what the Yemen story. The Israeli foreign minister, who is known as a bit of a blowhard and a yes man for the Prime Minister Netanyahu, testified to the Knesset Foreign Affairs Committee that Israel was participating in a so-called coalition in the Gulf, patrolling the waters off Yemen to make sure that the Houthis don't get supplied by Iran with weapons and any other equipment or material that is going to support their defense of Yemen against the Saudi invasion. And he reported this, and it was reported in the Israeli media, but no foreign journalist has taken the story up. And it strikes me as completely bizarre that no foreign reporter would think that Israel joining a Sunni coalition in Yemen and sending missile cruisers down the coast to interdict Iranian shipping is a worthy story, and that's kind of the role that I fill in the media universe. And the other story that we are talking about involves Israel sending 2 drones to Beirut, and there are 2 different versions of what the drones were doing there, but just sending the drones itself and attacking Beirut was a violation of an Israeli-Hezbollah agreement from 2006, the last war, in which 1,000 Lebanese were killed by Israel when it invaded. So the Israelis are claiming that they attacked a site in Beirut that contained an advanced machine that was helping to improve the precision of Hezbollah missiles, which would be used to attack Israel. And the Hezbollah is claiming that they attacked their press office in Beirut. So it's hard to know who is right, because each side is sort of dissembling when it's convenient to them. But a source, a confidential Israeli source, tells me that what happened afterwards when Hezbollah threatened retaliation was that there was an agreement that was brokered by Russia between Israel and Hezbollah that would allow Hezbollah to attack Israel, and the Israelis would accept this attack in order to avoid escalation into war, which really was almost likely under the circumstances at the time. And Hezbollah did attack an Israeli armored ambulance, and luckily no one seemed to have been injured or killed in that incident. If that had happened, Israel would have undertaken a massive retaliation against Lebanon, which could have led to the war that I'm talking about. And Israel, in retaliation, in response to the Hezbollah attack on the armored ambulance in the north, fired salvos into Lebanon, and those salvos were purposely directed into a barren area so that no one was injured. So there was apparently, and I say this apparently because there's so many different narratives put out by the IDF about what happened and why it happened, that we can't really know for sure. And I think this is also deliberate on their part, seeking to sort of put a smoke screen up so people really won't know the truth of what happened. But according to my source, both sides dodged a bullet here, and there was an orchestrated kind of theatrical thing that happened that avoided war. And let's also talk about the broader context here, that last week Israel attacked 4 Arab countries in the span of 2 days. They attacked Gaza, they attacked Lebanon, which we just mentioned, they attacked an Iranian base in Syria that Israel claims was preparing to send multiple drones on an attack against Israeli targets, and Israel has opened up a brand new front like it did in Yemen, in Iraq. And they killed a senior Iran Revolutionary Guard commander who was in a base in Iraq that was near the border with Syria. So Israel is really flexing its muscle here and trying to show Arab states and its enemies that it can conduct a multi-front war. I think this is really for Iranian, the benefit of the Iranians. And there seems to be this sort of like chest-thumping relationship going on between Iran and Israel as well. And I think this is meant for the benefit of the Iranians, to show them that Israel will not be deterred by anything that Iran can throw at them. And the Iranians in response are, I think, expanding their theater of operations against Israel in light of the sanctions that the U.S. has imposed and the world has imposed on Iran. So we're in a very, very dangerous situation here, that there's so many different fronts here that any one of them could have a disastrous incident and lead us into the sort of situation that was the start of World War I, where the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand led to this massive continental conflagration, that involved millions and millions of deaths. So I'm hoping that cooler heads can prevail here, although that's not certain, and that won't happen here.
Yes, and so this seems to be a circumstance in which it may be more often than we might know, where the phrase "the theater of war" has a dual meaning, where it's literally just the theater of war, where there are theatrics being managed, but right. Then of course there are multiple ongoing actual theaters of war where people are being killed. And in our last minutes, Richard, I did want for you to touch on the presentation and paper that you presented at an Islamophobia conference earlier this year, 2019, at Berkeley Law. I'm going to stop it right there, although I think that last aspect is about a paper that he presented earlier in this year, 2019, at Berkeley School of Law about Israeli technology and surveillance. And he makes some very serious points about how an Israeli minister has talked about the civil assassination of BDS supporters, meaning sort of taking them out socially. But then Richard makes the point that that obviously the Israelis have shown a history of not really having a strong sense of where the lines are in terms of civil assassination and physical assassination, and so he's concerned about this conjunction of the attack on civil society and activists in relationship to things like the NSO groups, Pegasus, cyber surveillance technology. So maybe we'll put up that entire interview and people can go listen to that section too. But in terms of what we're dealing with today, I thought that specific section where Richard Silverstein is dealing with this Middle East theater, Israel's role in all of it, but also then the brokering of the theatrics apparently between Hezbollah and Israel and Russia's role in all of that, I think is very, very interesting.
Yes, it is, and when you think about it, Silverstein has said he got this from an Israeli source, and currently, as far as what was said about this brokering in Russian activities prior to the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, I don't think there's any information that can be. I don't think there's any public record of this information, but certainly that would be something to certainly look to try and find, because this is a crucial piece of information if it's true, and if it's true, it would allude to it very much fits into the perspective of arming of a lot of theater and stagecraft you see with multiple sides of various conflicts over the decades, and not only the U.S. specializes in this, but very much there's been a Russian historical element with this, and this would even go back to I think we've talked about it briefly on the show before, Operation SIG, which was and this is about the managing of opposition to Israel and also opposition to Israel in the West as far as issues related to Palestinian rights organizations. And I even go back to the excerpt from it was Jack Bergman, correct? American Jew and racist Marxist Israel.
Jack Bernstein, I think it is.
Jack Bernstein. He alleges that the Soviets would arm the opposition to Israel, but never to the extent that it would become a threat to the actual threat to the state of Israel. And that's very interesting because you look at, obviously in the 1973 war, the U.S., gave emergency shipment of weapons to Israel from the Nixon administration. I think namely Kissinger in his, I believe he may have had a dual role as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State at the time, basically helped Israel defeat its opposition in the 73 war. But I think that this is interesting. It would make sense from a long-term picture that I would think it would make sense that while, the U.S., stands up, fights, U.S. is seen as the protector of Israel, especially in the Cold War days and moving on now, but in the nature of the Cold War in the Soviet Union and the opposition to certain Arab countries such as Egypt and Syria, and then later on with the Palestine Liberation Organization and even Hezbollah. And we're not making a definitive statement one way or the other about any of these entities, any of these organizations, and the nature of whatever backing they may or may not get. But I think from a long-term historical perspective, a case certainly could be made that Russia could step in, or the Soviet Union could step in and give assistance to these guerrilla organizations, these groups that are fighting against Israel, but also making sure that perhaps stage managing by not allowing these groups to get too powerful. I think that this is something to at least entertain the possibility of it. I'm very intrigued to know if in the future there could ever be any kind of validation or verification publicly of the of this information that Silverstein says he had gotten from Israeli sources regarding the nature of the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah conflict.
And in terms of following that, what popped in my mind when you were talking about this, about the management of what's titled the Israel-Palestine conflict, and of course, I don't think it's it's not a fair description of the situation of the Palestinians under occupation as calling it a conflict. That'd be like calling somebody who's been kidnapped in a conflict with their kidnapper at some level. But the geopolitics of all of this have been managed as a conflict, just as the so-called peace process, so-called two-state solution has been managed as destined to fail. Or the opposite, the inversion of Dennis Ross's book, Doomed to Succeed, Promised to Fail, you might title it. So there is that aspect, and so when you begin talking about that, it flashed into my head, and I believe I mentioned this before, that there's this autobiography of Ephraim Halevy, the former director of Mossad, and specifically the director of Mossad during the September 11, 2001 attacks, and it's titled Man in the Shadows, Inside the Middle East Crisis with the Man Who Led the Mossad, Ephraim Halevy. And I'm going to read a page from this. It's very early on, and it's actually I think it's one of the few places that his relationship with James Jesus Angleton is mentioned. And we've pulled on that thread, this relationship of Angleton to Israel more generally, Israeli intelligence, but then specifically this long-term relationship that Angleton had with Halevy, back to when Halevy was a very young intelligence officer of some sort in the D.C. area that was very, very close. And a lot of this has been very recently more thickly described by Jefferson Morley in his book about Angleton titled The Ghost, that talks about this history, this early history of the sealing of the deal of the intelligence relationship between the post-World War II U.S. and newly born Israel. And how Angleton is, of course, at the epicenter of that because he's the head of the Israel desk, but then he also plays a key role because he's the head of counterintelligence in the Central Intelligence Agency. And his alleged focus, and I think truthful, is his reality of focus was, of course, especially in the dawn of the Cold War on the Soviet Union. And then there's all these interesting questions, even from those early days, about the role of Israel in that larger relationship of the Cold War between the U.S. and Soviet Union. And I pointed out before that even Kim Philby, who's the most well-known, maybe Western, spook mole turncoat for the Soviets, and part of the Cambridge, I think they were called the Cambridge Five.
Yes, and it's just funny. Just the other day, we were both trying to call into C-SPAN's Washington Journal when Sebastian Gorka was on. Unfortunately, neither of us were able to get through. Gorka had mentioned that his father, this is in response to somebody calling his father a Nazi sympathizer in relation to the lapel pin that Gorka would wear that created a lot of controversy through his father's, the Hungarian military unit that his father was involved with. Gorka mentioned that his father had been betrayed by Kim Philby, the double agent, as he called himself.
Yes, and that was in response to his background in terms of his Hungary pin, I think. Wasn't that it? Something like that.
Yes. Yeah. It caused a lot of controversy because it was said to be basically a Nazi pin, related to an organization called the Vitesse Rend. So,
and if I'd gotten through, and actually, it's interesting you referenced that call, and I thought of that too. There were two good callers actually that morning about the high level elements of the State Department in terms of financial terrorism, intelligence, and the Israeli national, apparently, who's in charge of it now, I can't remember, Sigal
Mandelker. I want to say that's how the name is pronounced.
And one of the callers was making very clarified points about that office that was very much has been targeted against Iran, most obviously during the Trump administration, but even before that, I think, that was in the hands of Israeli partisans. And so that's interesting. If I'd gotten on, I wanted to deal. Actually, I did want to deal with Hungary, but I wanted to deal with it more in terms of the Trump campaign. I wanted to bring up a reference to the Budapest Bridge series of articles and Arthur Finkelstein, and the question of Orban and Netanyahu and Putin and Trump and all of that. But alas, we didn't get on. But we did learn that interesting fact about his dad, apparently, in Kim Philby.
Or at least the spin that he may or may not be putting on it, I don't know. But even in that, there's only a limited amount of time to call in for questions. There's so many places you could go with that. You could bring up the relationship between Arnon Milchan and director Andrew Vaj. And there's so many ways you could go with that. And I think it's such definitely a spot to hit someone like Gorkowitz, that he can't just respond with this standard response of anti-Semitism. So,
which he did to those two callers. It was interesting.
Right.
Of course.
Yeah. Pretty telling when that's your defense.
It's just such a horrible thing for C-SPAN to have these callers and totally anti-Semitic. And so I was this question of Halevy and Angleton and Kim Philby. People can go look up this question of Kim Philby. The Kim Philby looks like he was a Zionist agent before Israel was even formed. And it looks like he was probably a Soviet agent from way back too. But his early involvement with the Zionists, even in the run up to the formation of the Israeli state, is something that's very little known, and I think is crucial as even just a symbol of the larger dynamics of the Cold War and how Israel is in the middle of it and managing the dynamics of it in certain ways to its own benefit. And it turns out, and I can't remember the exact article where I learned this, but it may have even been a Daily Beast article, but people can go and find it. I think some of it comes from documents that were disclosed in the Matrokin archive, the Soviet Matrokin archives that were disclosed. But it put the pieces together that Kim Philby, was at the epicenter of the King David Hotel bombing in relationship to the British government. And that Philby had close relationships with Teddy Kollek, I think his name. He was a key Zionist operative. He was also the mayor of Jerusalem at some point. But that it looks like Philby, who was manning or involved with, I think, the MI6 desk in Jerusalem at the time, had actually, it looks like he'd actually distracted the British intelligence services in a way that potentially helped lead to the success of the King David Hotel bombing. Okay, so people should go make sure that I'm referencing that correctly. But if that's true, that is a very, very significant piece that would help us understand even this larger context of Kim Philby as a Soviet agent. And remember, Philby was also this close friend, maybe one of the closest friends that Angleton had, at least from that part of the world. And it is alleged that it was just a major sense of betrayal, and that it was sort of part of what led to what was described as this sort of institutionally debilitating paranoia that Angleton had in relationship to potential Soviet moles. And so there is a lot of questions there, and I think that even some things could be disentangled in a similar way that we've begun to disentangle our analysis of the Red Scare and the McCarthy hearings in the U.S. as in many ways actually sort of running a distraction or a sort of controversialized cover for much higher level spy networks that were replete throughout the U.S. government.
Yeah, I'm finding a couple of articles related to this topic of Kim Philby and his involvement in helping to sabotage British investigations into Zionist terrorism, as quoted as terminology is put in a foreignpolicy.com article from January 1st, 2014, written by Calder Walton, titled "How Zionist Extremism Became British Spies' Biggest Enemy," and it discusses Kim Philby and his role and possible motivations for perhaps lessening or trying to weaken the scope of British investigations into Zionist terrorism during that crucial period, which of course would include the King David Hotel bombing as one of the primary events, which led to the British being driven out of Palestine, which of course set the stage for what happened later on. And there's another article we found here is and we'll link these in our show notes. The Daily Beast, May 7th, 2017, written by Nico Hines, How Secret Russian Spy Kim Philby Helped Set Up Israel. A document uncovered by the Daily Beast shows that Soviet mole Kim Philby was hampering his British intelligence colleagues in their efforts to defeat the Zionist movement. So,
thank you for bringing that in. And I do want to just additionally point out that there's this question of how Philby was outed, apparently, inside of the British establishment, and this question of Flora Solomon, formerly Benenson, who apparently, the Benensons, I guess, apparently are a sort of a Rothschild-affiliated family, or maybe the Rothschilds of Russia. I've seen them described in certain ways as gold merchants, and then she is, I think the story goes, and this can be found too, that she was the one who told, I think, Victor Rothschild, and there's been actually very recent articles that are interesting about whether Victor Rothschild was a Soviet agent in the highest levels of the British establishment, but that Flora Benenson, then Solomon, it has basically said, Philby, and I believe she was a serious Zionist, that Philby had sort of gone from just being a Zionist to actually being a Soviet agent, potentially, or something like that, is when she told Victor Rothschild about it. But what's interesting about that also is if the case is that Victor Rothschild was actually a Soviet mole, additionally, on top of these the Philby and the Cambridge guys, then you can almost begin to see this as the way that in a similar way that sort of maybe higher level spy rings in the U.S. were maintained by the Hollywoodization, the controversialization, the Roy Cohn culture warification of the McCarthy investigation, in a similar way to this question of British intelligence and Soviet high-level moles. And I would just point out once again this deep connection to Zionism and the birth of Israel.
Yes, and in Flora Solomon's Wikipedia profile, in an excerpt from a SpartacusEducational.com biography of Flora Solomon. I'm not sure about the validity of the source. I'm just quoting this excerpt from the source here. When 1962, when Philby was the correspondent of the London Observer Actually, I'm going to read the first paragraph here. I'm sorry. Solomon was a longtime friend of British intelligence officer Kim Philby. She introduced him to his second wife, Eileen. Whilst working in Spain as the Times correspondent on Franco's side of the Civil War, Philby proposed that she become a Soviet agent. That's interesting. Wasn't Franco directly opposed to the Soviet agenda, you would think? His friend from Cambridge, Guy Burgess, was simultaneously trying to recruit her into MI6. But Soviet resident in Paris, Ozolin Haskin, codenamed, rejected this as a provocation. Had both moves succeeded, she would have become a double agent. In 1962, when Philby was the correspondent of the London Observer in Beirut, she objected to the anti-Israeli tone of his articles. She related the details of the contact to Victor Rothschild, who had worked for the MI5 during the Second World War. In August 1962, during a reception at the Weizmann Institute, Solomon told Rothschild that she thought that Thomas Harris and Kim Philby were Soviet spies. She then went on to tell Rothschild that she suspected that Philby and his friend Thomas Harris had been Soviet agents since the 1930s. Those two were so close as to give me an intuitive feeling that Harris was more than a friend, and that the some of this information also comes from a book titled Baku to Baker Street, written by I think this was Flora Solomon's autobiography, actually, Baku to Baker Street, written in 1984. So, and then one more interesting note is that Soviet defector Anatoly Golitsyn had already told the CIA about Philby's work for the KGB up to 1949. So.
Wow. Thank you for filling that in. And one other little interesting piece of this is that Flora Solomon turns out to be the mother of the co-founder, I believe, of Amnesty International. And I've seen this more referenced in relationship to the apparent intelligence background of some of these global human rights organizations, such as Amnesty International. But it's interesting then to further specify some of the deep background here in terms of these networks.
Yes, indeed. Peter Benenson is the name of the Amnesty International founder. I believe you brought this up before on the program. And the title of by the way, the title of Flora Solomon's 1984 autobiography is A Woman's Way, written in collaboration with Barnett Litvinov and published in 1984 by Simon & Schuster. The work was also titled From Baku to Baker Street, the memoirs of Flora Solomon. I guess that's her traveling from the Soviet bloc into the London establishment, London elite. So
very interesting. And so maybe finishing up on this Philby side street that I think is interesting and was worth exploring here. You pointed out that from that article that you were reading also that it looks like it might have even been beyond just the King David Hotel Zionist terrorism that Philby was potentially involved in running cover for or distracting from or whatever his mechanism was. That this is also, remember, that same time period that was that I referenced in the first fact in my question to Dennis Ross at the Kansas City Public Library in 2016, which was about the Stern Gang sending mail bombs to Truman in the year before he recognized Israel. But at the same time, the Stern Gang was sending multiple, I think the number was something like 8 letter bombs to different British officials. And so I just want to point out that Stern Gang is sort of seen as the sort of most extremist Zionist militant terrorist group. And I just heard and saw this very interesting thing that Christopher Bolin has written in a recent article titled The Epstein Connection to 9/11. He references some of Whitney Webb's work, and I had not realized this, but he puts a picture very early on in this article. It was published September 10th, 2019. He puts a picture of Yitzhak Shamir and Benjamin Netanyahu, and Netanyahu looking up at Shamir like he's sort of like his, sort of mentor, godfather type, and it's titled. It's described as, quote, Yitzhak Shamir and Benjamin Netanyahu at the Madrid conference, October 1991. Under pressure from the U.S. to reach a peace settlement with the Palestinians, Shamir created, quote, Mega, unquote, a group of rich American Zionists to support Israel. And Yitzhak Shamir had the background of the Stern Gang, okay? So we can then go ahead, it looks like, if this is correct, then we can go ahead and trace the background of the mega group to the Stern Gang, ultimately. And of which people like Kim Philby were apparently also helping run cover for in relationship to their political terrorism, okay? So people can go look at this article, fleshes out the Barak and Epstein and Wexner and Michael Chertoff, and ties in, some of the things that we've been pointing at in relationship to the investigations that Whitney Webb has been doing in relationship to the Epstein network, that this is also the 9/11 network. And Bolin begins to crystallize some of those pieces here, especially in relationship to this Epstein Barak Carbine 9/11 operation, which I think we should then, eventually we need to continue to deal with that including the question of the galloping of the Talpiot program, apparently at the highest levels of Pentagon cloud contracts, as we very briefly pointed out a couple shows back, in terms of General Dynamics IT winning a major multi-billion-dollar cloud deal. Microsoft is apparently has the Office, Microsoft Office has the cloud contract for the Pentagon's emails. So as we were focused on the so-called Jedi cloud, this whole other apparent compromise has already gone through, was already in the process of being rammed through. And so I guess we could already say that Israeli military intelligence, i.e. Adalom, i.e. the brought in Talpiot mole for Microsoft cloud cybersecurities, has already been given the contract for what are probably the most important elements in terms of, if you were talking about human intelligence of the Pentagon, the emails, right? Oh my gosh. If Israeli military intelligence is in charge of cybersecurity ultimately via Microsoft Office of the Pentagon's email infrastructure, there you go. There's the totality of like the communications, the digital communication, not the totality, but the large portion of the digital communications that then, when used by human intelligence, by a more Mossad type, are lead directly into things like continuing escalating political compromise, let alone surveillance. Okay, so that's still going on as we're dealing with some of this history, which we also need to deal with, because it helps us understand the more global aspect of what is actually taking place here. But so wanted to deal with that, but then I want to just get back into this question of Halevy, of Ephraim Halevy, the director of Mossad on September 11th, and his relationship with Angleton, and what was talked about in terms of their conversation about what you were referencing, Greg, in terms of the management of the quote-unquote Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including possibly the idea of the leadership, the highest levels of PLO leadership being potentially managed. There being indicators that they're being managed by then Soviet intelligence. Okay, so that's an aspect of this. But in order to understand why this might be so crucial and why someone like Ephraim Halevy is so crucial, let's touch back on this article by Wayne Madsen that we dealt with in our first 9/11/19 video, where we were in front of the Department of Transportation regional hub located in Kansas City, and it's titled. And we dealt deeply. I think we read this whole article last year in our 9/11 to 11/9 series. Yes. But it's titled Mossad Ran 9/11 Arab quote-unquote hijacker terrorist operation by Wayne Madsen, posted on 27th January 2011. Okay, and I'm going to read the first paragraph, and then I'm actually just going to read the first 4 paragraphs, and then we'll call it there, and then people can go read the article for themselves. But just to set up who is Halevy and why his take and relationship with Angleton and their apparent understanding of Palestinian leadership might be crucial. Okay. Quote, British intelligence reported in February 2002 that the Israeli Mossad ran the Arab hijacker cells that were later blamed by the U.S. government's 9/11 Commission for carrying out the aerial attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon. Wayne Madsen report has received details of the British intelligence report, which was suppressed by the government of then Prime Minister Tony Blair, unquote. And aside here, and I pointed this out also, is that this has resonance with the Department of Energy nuclear 9/11 report that is apparently that was written in 2003 and distributed to everybody within the U.S. national security apparatus who needed to know, and then was sat upon until much more recently, I believe in 2014, when Veterans Today began to put forth some of the information about nuclear 9/11. So it's interesting that we're talking about a 2002 a British intelligence report that was sat upon at the same time as there was a 2003 U.S. Department of Energy nuclear 9/11 intelligence analysis that was sat upon. And finally, we, the people, are beginning to understand what was kept from us, okay? So back to the article. Paragraph 2 from Mossad ran 9/11 Arab quote-unquote hijacker terrorist operation by Wayne Madsen, January 2011. Okay, quote, a Mossad unit consisting of 6 Egyptian and Yemeni-born Jews infiltrated quote-unquote Al-Qaeda cells in Hamburg, the Atta Mamun Darkanzali cell, South Florida, and Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates in the months before 9/11. The Mossad not only infiltrated cells but began to run them and give them specific orders that would eventually culminate in their being on board 4 regularly scheduled flights originating in Boston, Washington, Dulles, and Newark, New Jersey on 9/11. Unquote. An aside, of course, and I pointed this out in our video, a 9/11 video, go look at some of the analysis maybe of people like James Perloff and of Bolin in relationship to the nature of the background of the planes part of the intelligence operation of September 11th. And I do think there's something very crucial to what Bolin has put on the table about ATASCO, ATASCO, operating domestically in the United States from a background of Israeli military intelligence. Shaul Eisenberg, and there is apparently a Yoran that I don't believe Bolin knows he's not clear whether that he's related to the American Urons, most notoriously Amit Uran, the West Point graduate, apparently, I think it looks like sheep-dipped Israeli military intelligence into the heart of Pentagon cybersecurity. He ended up even heading the CIA's In-Q-Tel investment arm. But we've dealt with that before, but go look into that background of Bolin's analysis of Tasco and the potential background of the quote unquote plane side of the 9/11 operation. Okay. And now finally, I'm just going to read this third paragraph and then leave it there. Of Mossad ran 9/11 Arab hijacker terrorist operation by Wayne Madsen. Quote, the Mossad infiltration team comprised 6 Israelis comprising 2 cells of 3 agents who all received special training at a Mossad base in the Negev desert in their future control and handling of the quote-unquote Al-Qaeda cells. One Mossad cell traveled to Amsterdam where they submitted to the operational control of the Mossad's Europe station, which operates from the El Al complex at Schiphol International Airport. The 3-man Mossad unit then traveled to Hamburg where it made contact with Mohammed Atta, who believed they were sent by Osama bin Laden. In fact, they were sent by Ephraim Halevy, the chief of Mossad, unquote. Okay. And this is a very key article. It tells you the background of the alleged logistics behind the infiltration and the utilization of the quote unquote hijacker cells and the Al-Qaeda background, which was the creation of the background legend of what ultimately became a military operation on September 11th, where you see basically the vaporization of 1,000 human beings, including all of the building materials and all of that. So, but putting all of that aside, I just wanted to read that just so that people know that Ephraim Halevy is alleged to have been at the epicenter of the 9/11 operation. So now back to this question of Halevy and Angleton from Ephraim Halevy's book, Man in the Shadows, Inside the Middle East Crisis with the Man Who Led the Mossad. Okay, so this is interesting. This is very early on in the book. Page 6. And just last thing before I read this, it is interesting that this book, and I think I mentioned this, is framed largely around 9/11. and the sort of the time period surrounding 9/11. And of course, Halevy takes a little bit of time out to talk about the conspiracy theories coming mainly from the Arab world, and about Israel and 9/11 and Jews didn't show up, and all of that sort of canard stuff there in terms of what we know actually about Israeli nationals on 9/11. But I think it is interesting that he does address a little bit of this history of with Angleton. Okay. All right. So on page 6 of Ephraim Halevy's book, Man in the Shadows, quote, "On that September day in 2001, my mind was also on American colleagues, past and present, who shared my own concerns about the Middle East and worked with the government of Israel toward peace in the region. James Angleton was one of those people. I last saw Jim Angleton on April 30th, 1987. The legendary former counterintelligence chief was gravely ill and had passed me a message that he wished to see me one more time before he was to die. I had enjoyed a long personal relationship with this quote-unquote dreaded figure of the CIA that included 4 years of service in the Israeli embassy in Washington. We had spent literally hundreds of hours together in one-on-one meetings and had done many things together. I must have cut a very sad and humble figure as I entered his home in Arlington, Virginia, to see him lying quietly on the sofa in his living room. Within minutes we were immersed in earnest conversation, and Jim gave me his views on a large variety of issues. As always, there was one condition for these talks. Reporting had to go exclusively directly to the top when I returned to my country. The last point he made related to the future of Israel, a country that he dearly loved. Quote, never go for an international conference solution, unquote, he said. Quote, this is courting disaster. It would lead to imposed solutions, and you would be in a straitjacket. I fear Shimon Peres is too sure of himself and will always go for the quick fix. In this he is different from Moshe Dayan, who, although outwardly more dashing, is extremely cautious. Shimon thinks he can manipulate everybody, and this presents a grave danger to you all. Stay on as long as you can. Keep the faith, unquote. Tears welled in his eyes. Jim turned away and gradually fell asleep. I left his house never to see him again. The following day he was taken to hospital, and he died a few days later. Jim had cast his shadow over the agency for almost a quarter of a century. There were those who revered him and others who feared and hated him. His influence covered areas near and far. It was he who had arranged the first refresher course in physical protection for the then young and extremely vulnerable King Hussein of Jordan in the early 1950s. He was active in Europe and in other regions, but his penchant was always Soviet intelligence, and, most specifically, the workings of the KGB. He left no stone unturned in his pursuit of the, quote, forces of evil, unquote, and he always sought to reveal the hidden connection between terrorism and clandestine hostile intelligence. 3 years after he had retired from the agency, an enforced departure engineered by the then-director Bill Colby, I received one of many personal letters he regularly sent me. I was then stationed in Paris. In a few lines, he painted a panorama of the interconnections among players on the international scene, the likes of which only he was capable of doing. The letter carried the date of October 3rd, 1977, and focused on an incident with what Jim called, quote, poignant implications, unquote, that was not resolved during his CIA tenure. He described a visit to Moscow by Arafat that was much discussed in the Soviet media. The coverage included a photograph showing Arafat, quote, adorning the grave of Soviet leader Khrushchev with flowers, unquote. The photograph had 3 individuals pictured: Arafat, Zamyatin of the Soviet Foreign Office, and an unidentified agent with a, quote, bald head, unquote. Angleton went on to reveal that, quote, one of my old KGB men came running to me when we received the publication, unquote. He was excited to explain that he had worked closely with the bald man depicted. His agent described the man as a professional KGB agent who served in Karlshorst, Germany. Significantly, however, the KGB agent could only speak German and Russian. Angleton went on to note that, quote, I instituted a crash background research and investigation of Arafat to determine whether he knew German, unquote. Nothing was revealed at first to answer this question, and Arafat himself, it seemed, chose to be oblique about his youth and education when interviewed about it on television, noting that, quote, revolutionaries lived for the moment and the future, not for the past, unquote. Yet, before leaving the service, Angleton wrote that he did have one report that, in his youth, Arafat had studied engineering in Munich, Germany, and knew German. He continued, quote, I could never acquire confirmation or additional information on this matter, and my mind is not at rest as to the implications. What I wish is that the question of language be established beyond certainty, whether it favors my views or not. I have only discussed the broadest parameter of this line of inquiry, but, needless to say, if my KGB friend's information is wedded to the Arafat dossier, then we have a most significant political fact regarding the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, and the Soviets, ... unquote. Jim Angleton, King Hussein, Yasir Arafat, the KGB, the CIA, the Israeli body politic, the leaders of the United States and the countries of Europe, the leaders of the states of the Middle East. These are just a few strands that have crossed each other over the last few decades, and very much entwine themselves together on that nefarious day. Of course, there are so many more, and on that day I wondered about the role of policy of individuals, of organs of state in shaping the destiny of this 21st century of ours. As I said, I served in the Mossad for close to 40 years. I met heads of state, intelligence agents, persons of influence, and at the same time I was involved in countless operations, large and small, over close to 50 years. During all these years I've been bent on trying to keep the faith, as Jim Angleton asked me to do, as far as possible. Concerning the complex and virtually impossible world we live in, I shall try to provide you with the insight of an intelligence officer and a one-time diplomat. I have moved and functioned in the shadows for close to 40 years. Everything looks different from there. But in truth, which is the world of shadow and which is that of light? Which is the world of fantasy and which is the world of reality? Or are they a mix of the two? In truth, I am not entirely sure. Unquote. Okay, that ends on page 8 of Man in the Shadows by Ephraim Halevy, and then he goes on to describe this period of 1990 to 2003 that he chooses, he says, to dwell upon in his book, and very quickly mentions 9/11 and the 2005 London bombings. So I think it's an interesting background to begin to consider, too, in terms of this long-term relationship, very personally, of people like Ephraim Halevy, the Mossad's director on September 11th, back to these earlier questions of Angleton, Philby, this whole Cold War background. So I think I just wanted to read all that. I hope it wasn't too far.
No. I found particularly interesting the recollection of Yasir Arafat at Nikita Khrushchev's gravesite, and that doesn't in and of itself necessarily mean anything, but with the deeper question of the possibility of high-ranking officials within an organization such as the Palestine Liberation Organization. And of course we know Hamas was basically a construct of Israeli intelligence, that being the organization that's used to continue justifying the Israeli military assaults on Gaza, of course. But in relation to Arafat, I believe we may have mentioned this when we were discussing in a previous program about I don't know how close the relationship was, but there was a relationship between Arafat and Arnon Milchan. Arafat is quoted as saying that his favorite movie was Pretty Woman, which was directed by Arnon Milchan, starring Richard Gere and Julia Roberts. But that was quoted in Los Angeles Magazine in April 2000 as that being his favorite movie. But also, Arafat was said to admire Arnon Milchan because Arnon Milchan had I guess because of Arnon Milchan's similarities to James Bond, but in terms of his real life persona, but that there's questions about whether or not Arafat knew what Milchan may or may not have represented. But I find this interesting, and also I even go back in this context with the head of the Israeli the resistance to the Israeli occupation of Palestine, just even having any type of first name relationship, much less having photos taken of him with Arnon Milchan. It reminds me of just how odd it is that Oliver Stone has that relationship with Arnon Milchan. So I have to wonder if there's more to it than just Arafat just being somebody who maybe just admired the James Bond-like qualities of Arnon Milchan and enjoyed his movie Pretty Woman. So just something to throw out there. And I'll link to a picture of Milchan and Arafat together in a couple articles that go into the nature of what that relationship may have been like.
Well, that is interesting you bring that up. And the book Confidential by Meyer Doron and Joseph Gelman, subtitled The Life of Secret Agent Turned Hollywood Tycoon Arnon Milchan, deals with some of these aspects. And I'd forgotten that part of it, Greg, that you mentioned. And it's interesting, on chapter 2, on page 19, it's titled The New Age. And it starts with a quote from Arnon Milchan, and the quote is, quote, "When I told Arafat I was an 11th generation Israeli, he said, quote, 'You're more Palestinian than me,' unquote." And then later on in the book, on page 111, it says, quote, "Every choice is between two imperfect alternatives. Perez reasoned with Rabin. The movement of Black South Africa was with Arafat and with the Soviet Union and against Israel. Quote, 'But we shall never stop denouncing apartheid. We will never agree to that,' unquote," Perez said. And then it goes on to the background of David Kimche and this whole relationship with South Africa and all of that. So even that aspect, if you think about the relationship of the Cold War and as aspect of the modulation of the relationship between Israel and South Africa, and then Arafat in the mix there, there's a lot of pieces here.
Yeah, and of course David Kimche, you think of his nephew Greg Palast, and of course Palast seems to have a primary role in whatever this, if there is indeed this horseshoe we talk about. He's very prominent in the left side of that horseshoe, combination of his mocking people who think that the Iraq war wasn't just about oil, and think that Israel, there was a significant Israeli involvement in the lead up to the war in Iraq, but also Palast's role on the ground, such as RT and Real News Network, among others, reporting in a very limited fashion on the nature of the voting in various Midwestern states in the 2016 elections. So.
And that picture that you reference of Milchan and Arafat, it's actually on the cover of this book, Confidential, and they look very friendly. It's a very deep embrace, and they're giggling and all of that. So that's pretty interesting when you think about Milchan as a key operative in the development of Israeli nuclear program.
And it made me think of it when you mentioned the Khrushchev gravesite event. What you mentioned of possibly Arafat and high levels of the PLO being controlled or influenced by Soviet agents. So for me, I just go back to in that relation to Milchan's relationship with Oliver Stone, as well as his closeness to the late Hollywood Vajna, and Vajna's central role in helping Viktor Orban, ally of both Russia and Israel, both Putin and Netanyahu, consolidate his power. So
yes, and so we still need to do this deep dive into this Oliver Stone background with Milchan and more. Especially as he becomes sort of like one of the main guys from the quote unquote West to interview Putin, and we've already dealt with his being the main, the narrative shaper of the apparent limited hangout of the Kennedy assassination analysis, really, and how that was financed by an agent of Israeli nuclear intelligence. But to be able to put that in maybe in a larger framework of understanding in terms of the management of this East-West tension and the Cold War and how that's all evolving into the current moment might be interesting. But Greg, we're almost at 2 hours. Do you want to touch on this question of the aspects of the Litvinenko book, Blowing Up Russia, and how it even mentions Khashoggi in there, and in relationship to the apparent staging of terrorism in Russia and wars in Russia and all of that?
I think this might be better for maybe to do another program when we have more time, but we can briefly touch upon it. And I mean the information that was in that you found, that you dug up, that you just received Litvinenko's book. Do you have the title of it?
It's called Blowing Up Russia: The Fake Bombings That Launched Putin, by Alexander Litvinenko and Yuri Felshtinsky.
What you got out of this book, what we were just reading when we were talking among ourselves yesterday, is
what? What'd you say?
It's so damning in the context of what we were talking about earlier with Putin's rise to power, largely coming on very hawkish responses to likely false flag terrorism, as in the case of the Russian apartment bombings, which were blamed on Chechen Muslims, and therefore was the justification for Putin to ride a wave to power based on creating an atmosphere of war, very similar to what happened in the U.S. after September 11th. And I will note that if you want to say anything else about this, go ahead. But I will note that this book was published posthumously after Litvinenko's mysterious death related to, I believe, polonium. And so I think what is in, I think the kind of information that we're just getting from this, and we haven't even, I don't know how much of the rest of the book you've even looked into, but this shows me, I think it's about much more than just simply, the way that maybe say some of the people who are very much in a Russia sphere within, there I go using that term again, within what we call the alternative media. It's more than just about simply, Litvinenko being a critic of Russia and a Western pawn and puppet, although he may ultimately have been that. I don't know. But the information is damning, and I would say it's even more damning. I always point back to how, the real truth about Trump's history and background, and the real, I'd say, damning information about him is hardly, if ever, discussed within the anti-Trump media. You don't hear about this aspect of Putin's history pretty much anywhere. You never hear about it when you hear all the saber rattling, that all the alleged hatred of Russia and Putin that's said to emanate from networks like CNN or outlets like the New York Times. And so I find it interesting that none of this has really been dug into like you would think it would be.
Yeah, it's this question of false flag terrorism too. This is an area, actually, I believe I heard little bits about some of these questions, maybe even on an NPR affiliate while driving to Kansas City a few weeks back, I think, that dealt with the questions of false flag terrorism in relationship to the apartment bombings in Russia in the late 90s. But it is very interesting that this is another area where large aspects of the dissident or progressive left are covering it up very similarly to the way that they're covering up 9/11 in many ways, I would say. And so this is a key to understand. And there's not tons written about this, actually, which, should, I don't know exactly what that means, but I just want to reference that there is this Litvinenko book, Blowing Up Russia, but there's also a book by David Satter, who I think is an American journalist. Here's the background here, so we can get critical of the background. David Satter, the book is titled "The Less You Know, the Better You Sleep: Russia's Road to Terror and Dictatorship Under Yeltsin and Putin." And
yes, Satter is American, and he was expelled from Russia by the Russian government in 2013. And a quick Google search shows that he is a contributor to the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which I'm sure would just discredit any kind of any kind of inquiries into the legitimacy of his work from, say, maybe the Jimmy Dores or Aaron Mateys of this world, as well as the Hudson Institute, which is known to be super neocons. That's interesting.
Yes, so that was exactly
senior fellow at the Hudson Institute.
Yes, so. That's what it says on the book jacket. So I was going to mention that. Yeah, so let's we'll weigh the background of these sources while also delving into the potential aspect of that. Just as we're very obviously willing to recognize that such state entities as Russia Today will often report on the truth, even if it's under the guise of it's propaganda. It has a state function for some reason, and that it's not really the truth is not the overriding reason for the reporting of Russia Today. It's as for some part of state propaganda. Similarly, even if we consider the background of the Litvinenkos and the Satyrs here, then at the very least, we need to consider that even if they are acting as propagandists of some sort, that the truth might be in the mix there. And then it's up to us to decide if the truth is in the mix and then what we're going to do with that. But what's interesting is when you actually deal with, there's two different questions here. There's the question of the actual nature of the apartment bombings themselves, where there's forensics involved there on the ground, the actual reporting of the specifics of that we'll have to get into later. But for now, I just wanted to delve into this very interesting question of the management of the quote unquote Chechen opposition, and how that all played right in the mix of these apartment bombings, and how apparently, and the reporting from this, I believe in both books, both the Litvinenko book and the Satyr book, actually has to do with an article that was from Versiya, Versiya, the original article titled, quote, The Agreement. And the apparent source of some of these alleged facts in this article actually coming apparently from aspects of French intelligence. So once again, yes, let's consider the background, but we should also then consider the question of the role of truth, faithful, and individually patriotic and loyal to humanity elements of different national security apparati, including intelligence agencies. And I think we can point to that all around. We can point to aspects of UK, US, French. We can point to even Russian naval intelligence who are apparently involved in some aspect of transferring the DOE nuclear report to Veterans Today elements. I don't know the full background of that, but I think it can be said that there are good faith elements of the intelligence services around the world in each of these countries that all have their own issues in terms of the top-down control and all of that.
Yeah, and I think this should go without saying, but I mean, it's just like RT from I would say like RT and Sputnik do tell an awful lot of truth about America and from the West, but I increasingly see a very weaponized nature to that it's being done for various propaganda reasons as opposed to a vested interest in really exposing the truth for humanity. I think it's the same way with Western sources, American sources, British sources, these kind of people that are putting out the narrative on what we call Russiagate, is that, the motives don't have to be pure for there to be a good portion of truth coming out of these sources. So I think that that should go without saying, but I think sometimes we forget about that, and we sometimes, we're all guilty of this, I think. We get into our own, like a cheerleader for one side or the other, no truth can ever come out of, the side that you're not on, or so to speak, or whatever. And so I see a lot of that, but I think it is a matter of taking sources and trying to differentiate maybe what might be facts from what might be propaganda, or even differentiating factual information from the motivations for publishing it or putting it on the record.
So in finishing up, I guess I'm going to propose that I actually read, something 6 pages from the beginning of chapter 6, or which will definitely challenge my pronunciation abilities in relationship to Russian names and Chechen names. But I also could then hone in just specifically on like a page or two specifically surrounding Adnan Khashoggi. Do you have a take on that, Greg?
No, I'm cool with that. I just at the very end I want to at least mention at least quickly delve into this Robert Kagan Washington Post article we mentioned earlier, but I have no issue with this right now.
All right, then I'll just go ahead and read it, and then we'll leave it be there, and then you can finish up with this Robert Kagan article, which is very interesting.
And just some of the questions regarding the nature of these inner squabbles within the foreign policy establishments, and also maybe even tying that into the resignation of John Bolton and trying to figure out what Bolton represents and where it comes and where it might differentiate. So anyway,
what Bolton represents, and what did you say?
Where it might that is representative of the bigger Trump agenda, and where it might differentiate in some ways. Anyway, we'll talk about that after this, and as we're starting to get into the latter stages of our show here today.
Okay, so from Blowing Up Russia, the fake bombings that launched Putin by Alexander Litvinenko and Yuri Felshtinsky. Chapter 6, page 100. Quote, the FSB resorts to mass terror. Buynaksk, Moscow, and Volgodonsk. The perpetrators of the terrorist attacks in Buynaksk, Moscow, and Volgodonsk were never found, and we can only guess at who was behind the attacks by analogy with the events in Ryazan. In these three towns, the Ryazan-style quote-unquote exercises were carried through to their intended conclusion, and the lives of several hundred people were abruptly cut short or completely devastated. In August 1999, all the members of Lozovsky's group were at large in society, including Vorobyov. At that time, yet another military operation was just approaching its conclusion in Dagestan, into which the Chechen separatists had made an incursion. A lot has been said and written since that time about this Chechen encroachment into Dagestan. It has been claimed that the invasion was planned in the Kremlin and deliberately provoked by the Russian security services. The Russian media were full of articles about a conspiratorial meeting in France between Shamil Basayev and the head of the president's office, Alexander Voloshin, organized by the Russian intelligence agent A. Surikov in France. We are not in possession of enough facts to draw absolutely definite conclusions. Let us begin with Surikov's interview. On August 24, 1999, the newspaper Versia, a part of the holding company Sorveshenyo Sekretno, that was headed by Artem Borovik, who died in a plane crash together with the Chechen businessman Zia Bazayev on March 9, 2000, published an interview with Colonel Surikov of the GRU, a person close to Yevgeny Primakov on the one hand and to Yuri Moslyukov on the other. During the Georgian-Abkhazian conflict, Surikov served under Abkhazian Defense Minister Sultan Soznalayev. In the course of the war, he became acquainted with Basayev. From then on, he was considered an expert on the Caucasus. In the editorial note that preceded the interview, Versia reported that it was Surikov who had organized the, quote, secret meeting with the head of the president's office, Voloshin, unquote. Neither Surikov nor Voloshin denied this statement. Surikov reported that, and this is a long quote, Shamil Basayev and Hatab created fortified areas in Dagestan on a scale not even suspected by the press. They dug trenches, erected fortifications, established arms and ammunition supply lines from Chechnya. They also established communication and transportation networks between each other and Chechnya. Minefields surround the fortified areas. My professional opinion is that using artillery and aviation alone, as the federal troops have been doing in the mountains of Dagestan, is not enough. So far, the Federation's actions have been ineffective and have not caused damage to the enemy's forces or fortifications. In order to liquidate the fortified areas, a ground offensive with air support is necessary. The federal formations being organized in Dagestan are made up of odd scraps. policemen from the Urals, SWAT from Murmansk, various components from the Defense Ministry, large numbers of conscripts. According to my sources, conscripts constitute 1/3, contrary to the general's assurances that conscripts aren't sent to Dagestan. It is pointless to talk about, quote, streamlining, unquote, such a diverse crowd for active duty. There are as many as 30 generals in the region at the moment, although a single well-coordinated regiment would be sufficient to liquidate the Chechen fighters. And with coordinated activity and unified command in place, a single colonel could be in charge of the entire operation. At that moment, all of these generals are simply making a huge mess of the chain of command since they belong to different departments. Therefore, in the current situation, a military operation would cause great casualties among our soldiers and policemen. I would predict that 300 to 400 of our men would die in an attack, and we already have approximately 250 dead and wounded. Despite the general's assertions to the contrary, the Chechen fighters have suffered minimal losses, about 40 people. They might lose about as many in an assault. In general, reports about losses on the Chechen side, thousands killed in one day, remind me of reports from the Chechen War of 1995 to 1997. Our generals evidently fail to take into account the fact that Shamil Basayev is an experienced guerrilla fighter who became an expert in sabotage long before the war in Chechnya. He went through a complete training course in one of the Russian intelligence agencies. This was during the peak of the Georgian-Abkhazian War. At the time, Moscow took a cowardly stance, and instead of acting in defense of Abkhazia, where a genocide was taking place, the only thing that the Russian forces did was to offer unofficial assistance to the volunteer detachments that went off to war. Pavel Grachev, who was Minister of Defense at the time, pretended not to know about this, and 1/4 of these volunteers who came to fight in Abkhazia were Chechens, and their leader was Shamil Basayev. Basayev is now making significant tactical improvements to the military actions in Dagestan. He's holding down a fortified area in Botlika, but this is merely a diversionary maneuver. He's starting to establish a guerrilla movement. Along with sabotage, this is the most effective means to conduct a war in a forested mountainous region. Now his tactics consist of short attacks on columns of federal forces, organized ambushes, mining roads, shelling strategic targets with RPGs. The Kremlin knew that Dagestan was about to be invaded by the Wahhabis. They could not have known it. They were warned about it by the secret services. Even Versia wrote about it. So why did they blow it? Because there are people in the Kremlin who seriously believe that individuals such as Basayev can be paid to do anything that Moscow tells them. On the whole, the Russian secret services also slept through Basayev's invasion of Dagestan. Because our secret services are now at that stage of decay when it becomes hard to deal with direct obligations on account of business commitments, they're only capable of bulldozing reporters like Pasco, and even then unsuccessfully. The situation in the Caucasus can still be salvaged, but there's no one to salvage it." Unquote. What is remarkable is not that Surikov gave Versia an interview, but that his interview was given 3 weeks after Versia's publication of the original materials about the meeting between Voloshin and Basayev. Had Surikov thought that Versia's earlier article did not correspond to reality, he would have either refused to grant Versia an interview or else made use of the opportunity to refute it. Versia's original article was titled, quote, "The Agreement," unquote. It was published on August 3rd, 1999. And this is quoting from that agreement article, a long quote. Quote, "A luxurious villa in the French town of Boulogne, situated between Nice and Monaco, had been watched by the French secret services for a long time. The villa belongs to the international arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi. And although nothing can be said against Khashoggi from the perspective of the French criminal code, the Saudi billionaire has a suspicious reputation. Versia was informed about the heightened interest in Khashoggi by a source in the French secret services, whose name we will not publish. He is a professor of political science and at the same time an expert in Russian defense, security, and organized crime issues. He frequently speaks out in the press and takes part in investigative reporting. He works under contract for French government agencies, including French counterintelligence. This source has reported that the French put the villa under close surveillance at the beginning of July, when the Venezuelan banker Alfonso Davidovich moved in there with his young black secretary. In the Latin American press, Davidovich is described as a money launderer for the left-wing insurgent organization FARC, F-A-R-C, Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, which has been engaged in a military conflict with the official authorities for several decades. FARC's principal source of funds is believed to be the drug trade. It soon turned out that one of Davidovich's rather frequent visitors was a certain French businessman of Israeli-Soviet origin, the Sukhumi-born 53-year-old Yakov Kosman. That's with a K, K-O-S-M-A-N.
Now, real quick before you continue, I just want to throw in that do a search for either of those names you just mentioned, Alfonso Davidovich or Yakov. What's the last name again?
Kosman.
Yakov Kosman. There is virtually nothing on either of these people. And Davidovich, and this is what I find really interesting. You mentioned the FARC, but Davidovich is referenced as an ally of Hugo Chavez. And so, I believe Davidovich is married into the family of a Venezuelan, of a former Venezuelan general. So, and I'll get the, not quite 100, I don't have the links right in front of me at the moment on this particular angle here with Davidovich, but I think if we could figure out more on who this person is and others around him, it might give us somewhat of an increased little bit of an understanding of the nature of what's going on in Venezuela, because it's very interesting to me that someone who is described as a Chavez ally would be involved in these kind of operations. And I'm going to actually take a minute to try and look this up real quick while you keep reading.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, definitely. We haven't yet heard of a Khashoggi Chavez connection, which is what this could apparently be, which is very, very strange, right? Okay. So, back to the text after Kosman. After a while, this is page 104 of Blowing Up Russia by Alexander Litvinenko and Yuri Felshtinsky. I can't say Felshtinsky. There you go. Page 104. It soon turned out that one of Davidovich's rather frequent visitors was a certain French businessman of Israeli-Soviet origin, the Sukhumi-born 53-year-old Yakov Kosman. After a while, Kosman arrived at the villa with 6 people who had come through Austria with Turkish passports. An aside, by the way, doesn't that sound like Lauder Epstein's Austrian passport with a listed Saudi address and all of that? This is interesting. Okay.
Yes, it does.
I guess this just says that they came through Austria with Turkish passports. So it actually doesn't say it's an Austrian passport. So never mind so much on that connection. But okay, quote, after a while, Kosman arrived at the villa with 6 people who had come through Austria with Turkish passports. One of these Turks was identified by the secret services as Tsveba, that's Tsveiba, who at one time so distinguished himself in the Georgian Abkhazian War that he is still charged with war crimes by the authorities in Tbilisi. Do you remember how to say that, Greg? Tbilisi?
I want to say Tbilisi, and please forgive me if I butchered it. But
I think you're right.
I want to say Tbilisi.
Okay, I'm going to say Tbilisi. Okay. Quote, Tbilisi, including massacres of the civilian population. All 6 moved into the villa and did not leave its confines for 3 weeks. Finally, the secret services were able to observe Kosman together with Tsveba and one other guest, presumably an Abkhazian, departing for the local airport in Nice. At the same time, 2 people arrived at the airport in a private plane from Paris. One of them, Sultan Soznaliev, had been the Abkhazian Minister of Defense during the years of the Georgian Abkhazian War and effectively the number 2 man in the republic after Vladislav Adzimba. Ardzinba. The second person who came out of that airplane was another individual from Sukhumi, Anton Surikov. During the years of the war in Abkhazia, Surikov had served under Sosnaliev. Operating under the assumed name, quote, Mansour, unquote, he was responsible for organizing acts of sabotage. Subsequently, under his real name, Surikov occupied a key post in the administration of Yevgeny Primakov, although his official title was merely assistant to First Deputy Prime Minister Yuri Maslikov. Both of them proceeded to the villa in Bulyo. In the middle of July, 2 days after the couple's arrival, the private British yacht Magia arrived in the port of Burlo from Malta. Two quote-unquote Englishmen came ashore from the boat. If their passports are to be believed, one of these quote-unquote Englishmen was a certain Turk by the name of Mehmet, formerly a consultant to the Islamist Prime Minister of Turkey, Erbakan, a rather influential figure in Turkish, Middle Eastern, and Caucasian Wahhabist circles. The second person, to the surprise of the secret services, was the well-known Chechen field commander Shamil Basayev. Incidentally, he had also at one time been Sosnaliev's deputy and headed the Chechen forces in Abkhazia. The French intensified their surveillance, and for good reason. Late in the evening, on an airplane belonging to one of Russia's oil companies, a man arrived at the Nice airport. The man was balding, had a beard, sharp eyes, and bore a strong resemblance to the head of the Kremlin administration. After passing through French passport control, this individual looked around intently. He was dressed in a formal suit, with a suitcase, and without any bodyguards. The balding man calmed down only when he saw the people who were there to meet him, two Abkhazians and Surikov. All of them got inside a Rolls-Royce and drove off to the villa in Bulyo. That entire night something went on at the villa. The villa's security was especially vigilant, and there was so much magnetic radiation in the area surrounding the villa that cell phones within a radius of several hundred yards stopped working. In the morning, the same Rolls-Royce drove to the airport, and the person who resembled Voloshin flew back to Moscow. The following day, all of the guests at the villa departed. It should be noted that Versiya turned out to be remarkably unyielding, even stubborn in insisting on the theory that the invasion of Dagestan in August 1999 was organized by Russian secret services. In particular, on February 29, 2000, a few days before the deaths of Borovik and Basayev and the presidential election that brought Putin to power, the newspaper published an article titled Khasbulatov's Conspiracy, unquote. And this is a quote from that. After Khasbulatov informs the Kremlin about the coup d'etat being prepared in Chechnya, the head of the president's office, Alexander Voloshin, according to certain sources, hurries to a meeting with Shamil Basayev in France. This meeting is organized for Voloshin by Anton Surikov, a GRU colonel close to the authorities, or more concretely, close to the circle of Yevgeny Primakov, the former head of Federal Intelligence. Immediately after the talks in France, Shamil Basayev invades Dagestan. Then comes the apartment house bombings in Moscow and other Russian cities, and then the second Chechen campaign. That is how wars start. And that's the end of the quote directly from the article. And back to the book.
Thanks for reading all that, and I think that this is critical information. I think once again for me, it's just what stuck out to me was the relative, and not just relative, but almost complete blackout in terms of information on many of those figures that you mentioned in relation to these pre-Chechen war machinations that were going on. And I did find the information I wanted to mention about Alfonso Davidovich, and the source actually is from I believe we were talking about this article among ourselves yesterday. It's article from Peter Dale Scott from October, written on October 29, 2005, the Global Drug Meta Group, Drugs, Managed Violence, and the Russian 9/11. And Peter Dale Scott gets this information from a Russian website article written by Yuri Yasinev, titled, the English title is An Orange Revolution in Store for Russia, published on ru.compromat. I have not been able to find an English translation of this article. Anyway, this is Yasinev's description of Alfonso Davidovich, Venezuelan, lives in Munich, has German and Venezuelan citizenship, speaks Spanish, English, French, German, and Russian fluently, and then through special training in the USSR and East Germany, owns companies and banks in Barbados, the Caymans, and other offshores, has friendly relations with Hugo Chavez, and is acquainted with Fidel Wolf. I believe Marcus Wolf was West German Stasi.
Yes, he was, and then he was brought into the U.S. in relationship to as an asset of the U.S. and to also help work on Department of Homeland Security. I think Marcus Wolf and then Oleg Kalugin are sort of the two main Soviet sphere defectors. But will you read that part again about the relationship with Marcus Wolf right before that?
Okay, it says, has friendly relations with Hugo Chavez and is acquainted with Fidel Castro, Marcus Wolf, and Adnan Khashoggi. Has many contacts in Colombia, including FARC. In 1999, Davidovich was alleged to have engaged in arms trafficking for guerrillas in Chiapas, Mexico, and in money laundering for the Colombian drug mafia. Finances anti-globalization movement in Europe and Latin America.
Interesting.
This is very important here. I mean, because friendly relations with Chavez, and actually also believe Davidovich is married into the family of a deceased Venezuelan general by the name of Alberto Muller Rojas. So, yeah, this is because right here, this is basically tying a significant figure into this Crimea, into this Chechnya intrigue with what you would call the global left. The global south is, you hear it called in a lot of anti-imperialism circles through Chavez and Fidel Castro, and even financing Mexican guerrilla armies, guerrillas fighting, and as well as the Colombian drug mafia, FARC. And yeah, I want to get more information on this, because this person is somebody who I think there needs to be more information about. I mean, this is wild that there's just such a black. I wanted to read about Yakov Abramovich Kosman. Quoted, this is Peter Dale Squat quoting from the same article in the Russian media source ru.compromat, American title, in English, An Orange Revolution is in Store for Russia, by Yuri Yasinev. And this is what Yasinev says about Yakov Kosman. Yakov Abramovich Kosman, born 1946, resides in Nice, France, has German and possibly Israeli citizenship, involved in real estate operations and banking, has contacts with Kosovo, Albanian criminal societies in European countries. In 1997 through 2000, he served as a financial consultant to Hashim Thasi, I'm not sure how that last name is pronounced, the chief commander of KLA. That would be the Kosovo Liberation Army. And of course, it was the Kosovo Liberation Army that the U.S. was ostensibly siding with in the military intervention in Yugoslavia in the late 90s. So, and one more thing here. Consider that in 1998, the U.S. State Department listed the KLA, formerly known as the Ustria, I'm going to butcher this, Ustria Klirimtare Kosovas, or UCK, as an international terrorist organization, saying it had bankrolled its operations with proceeds from the international heroin trade and from loans from known terrorists like Osama bin Laden. And that last part comes from a Washington Times article, KLA funding tied to heroin profits, May 3rd, 1999, as cited by Peter Dale Scott. This is amazing, and there's practically no information about either of these men anywhere.
We need to continue this research, because we have to figure out how to analyze all of this. Because my instinct is that this basically points out that our intuition, or let's say our analytical intuition, that the Cold War was in many ways a managed synthetic operation in some way, where both sides, so quote unquote, both sides are controlled and guided towards certain specific ends. And then we've talked about how then this gets transferred into the 21st century in terms of the global war on terror as a sort of global still obviously synthetic, but also synergizing, where all the pieces are finally then being brought together on the same side against the quote-unquote threat of the global terrorist in many ways. So I think that, and that may be wrong. That may be the wrong analysis of this, and I'm open to that. But that's my sense of what these pieces begin to suggest, because you begin to see these sort of like groups that are, and either there's sort of moles of both sides in terms of both sides of the Cold War being inserted against each other, or the reason that you see these pop-ups, especially in relationship to these deep events, such as these events that help the rise of the into the 21st century, the Russian authoritarian, terrorist state complex, right? Which is what this is really all surrounding. That's my sense of what this is.
And also, this information here, I think, provides a deeper perspective. I mean, it even goes deeper into the network surrounding very much the indirectly or indirectly the elements that obviously led to Vladimir Putin's rise to power in Russia. And this brings a different dynamic in from like the oligarchs and the business people and the mob figures who we already know about. So, yeah.
Okay. Should I continue reading? Did you have more to say in that,
No, if you want to continue on.
Okay, I'll do a little bit more. There's one more segment that references Khashoggi, and then maybe we'll let it go. Okay, so it finishes off from the article, the Versia article, I think it is, titled Khasbulatov's Conspiracy. It finishes off, that is how wars start. Okay, so we're on page 106 of Litvinenko and Felshtinsky's Blowing Up Russia, the Fake Bombings That Launched Putin. Quote, the bibliography of the meeting between Voloshin and Basayev would not be complete without a reference to, quote, Conspiracy 2, unquote, the final article in this series. The article was published again in Versia on July 2nd, 2000, after Putin's election victory, outside the context of any election campaign. It represented an expanded version of the earlier article, quote, Conspiracy, unquote, with new excerpts. And this is a long excerpt that I will read, and then after I finish this excerpt, then maybe we'll finish up with this. Page 106 of Blowing Up Russia, the FSB Resorts to Mass Terror by Litvinenko and Felshtinsky. Quote, the meeting supposedly took place at the villa of the international arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi in the village of Bulyol near Nice on July 4th, 1999. Earlier, sources in the French and Israeli secret services, which had provided this information, reported that, quote, there exists a video of the meeting at the villa in Bulyol, unquote. However, they offered no evidence. At the end of June, Versia received a large mail envelope without a return address. The envelope contained a photograph of 3 men. Pictured on the left was an individual resembling Anton Surkov, assistant to former First Deputy Prime Minister Yuri Maslikov. Pictured in the middle was a person bearing a very close resemblance to the head of the Kremlin office, Alexander Voloshin, balding and with a similar beard. Next to these 2 individuals was a squatting person wearing shorts, balding but with a more substantial beard. After some time, Versia received a phone call, and the caller, without introducing himself, said, quote, this is a photograph of the meeting between Voloshin and Basayev. Voloshin is easy to recognize. Basayev is the bearded man on the right, unquote. The unidentified caller specified that the photo was printed from a still frame and that the recording was made on an analog video camera, ... At the time of the meeting, Surkov was a consultant to the general director of MiG Company. At present, he is still working with Masliakov, but now heads the Committee on Industry, Construction, and Scientific Technology in the Duma, ... According to verifiable information from the French and Israelis, the private British yacht Magia, that's Magia, arrived at the Bouillot port from Malta on July 3rd. 2 passengers disembarked. If their passports are credible, one of these, quote, Englishmen, unquote, was a certain Turk by the name of Mehmet, ... The second person, to the surprise of the intelligence officers, was Chechen Field Commander Shamil Basayev, ... Late in the evening of July 4th, a man arrived at the Nice airport in a private plane belonging to one of Russia's oil companies. The man was balding with a small beard, sharp eyes, and resembled the head of the president's administration, ... Whether by coincidence or not, sometime later, in August, Shamil Basayev's group invaded Dagestan. The resignation of Prime Minister Sergei Stepashin soon followed. The former head of the FSB replaced him. After this, federal troops successfully repulsed the attack on Dagestan, and in pursuit of the Chechen fighters once again entered rebellious Chechnya. The, quote, anti-terrorist operation, unquote, in the Chechen Republic has been going on since that time and is unlikely to end in the near future. It should be noted that different sources have given different explanations of the purpose of the visit to Bouillot by individuals resembling Voloshin and Basayev. According to one hypothesis, the subsequent invasion of Dagestan constituted a public relations stunt within the framework of the Operation Air, H-E-I-R. According to a contrary hypothesis, the man resembling the head of the president's administration had learned from the Russian secret services about Basayev's intentions and had asked individuals who had once worked with him, presumably Anton Surikov, to arrange a meeting with Basayev in order to attempt to prevent the invasion, unquote. Okay, there's a lot more here in terms of additional information about those different interpretations, also about more about Dagestan and Wahhabism in relationship to that region, and I don't know exactly what all to make of this quite yet, but I just wanted to make sure that we at least got the aspects that referenced Khashoggi, who's obviously also at the epicenter of something like the Iran-Contra and Epstein network going back, and get that out onto to our record.
Yes, indeed, and we will we'll keep tabs on this, and I'd really like to try and get into some of the further information regarding some of those people, particularly Davidovich and Yakov. Katsov, I believe it was.
Kosmin, yeah, I think.
Yakov Kosmin. I want to know more about those two, particularly both, Davidovich, but as well as Kosmin and his financing, his relationship with the head of the Kosovo Liberation Army. I feel like these are important details to really figure out more about. Anyway, okay, I think we are going to start wrapping up here, as we've been going longer than we wanted to. This is a rare opportunity where we get a chance to have a long, drawn out conversation like this. But I do want to finish up by talking about page essay that was published in the Washington Post this past Sunday, and that is written by Robert Kagan, titled "Israel in the Decline of the Liberal Order: The Rise of Nationalism Around the Globe May of Israeli Elections on Tuesday."
Wait, say the title again. It dropped out halfway through.
Okay, I'm sorry. Israel and the Decline of the Liberal Order. The rise of nationalism around the globe may be reflected in the outcome of Israeli elections on Tuesday. And anyhow, Robert Kagan, as we know, he's considered one of the arch neocons. He was one of the people behind the Project for a New American Century, of course, along with William Crystal and various others. We've all long identified him as being in the class of this DC neocon. We've called him not so much Israel first as Israel second, meaning that the likes of Robert Kagan, they're very William Crystal, people like that, they're very Zionist. They're very strongly pro-Israel, but they are very strongly pro-Israel as far as Israel part of what Kagan calls the liberal world order, which is carried out by American global leadership with a strong Europe and strong quote unquote democratic institutions such as the European Union and so
we've also titled them paleo neocons is another way we've talked about it, and I would say that relates to them being maybe closer to the Straussian source of neoconservatism as a sort of an architecture for Western, the way they would see it as Western and American, specifically global leadership.
Yes, and we've talked about this a lot, and this is an important, I think, these are important differentiations that are not really, they aren't really explained, I don't think, in very many places for sure. Certainly, the majority of what we know as the alternative media, and I believe that this is a major part of, I think, what we're seeing play out right now in terms of, geopolitics and some of the opposition, obviously, to what we're seeing with President Trump within the foreign policy community. And this is a long essay. As I said, it's 4 pages. I'm not gonna read through most of it. I want to read through a few parts of this though, particularly where Robert Kagan lays out his grievances with the shift of Israel, the Israeli government under Netanyahu to what he calls to the right-wing nationalist sphere that's very anti-democratic, that is contrary to the liberal world order that he says has helped Israel thrive and has maintained its existence for the last 70 years. And I will add that there's some disinfo, you might say, in this article, that Kagan portrays Israel as a tiny little country that's surrounded by its enemies as if it doesn't really have any influence, or it doesn't really have any real power. And he also, I think he also manages to get wrong the very manufactured controversy between the right and and fascism. And I think when you look at these aspects I'm about to talk about here from a long-term perspective, this element I think's always been in place, but I think that Kagan paints some of these Israeli Zionist partnerships with right-wingers as being, it's artificial and it's by accident. But anyway, I wanted to read this paragraph here in particular where Kagan talks about, where lays out what I call his grievances with what Israel's doing in recent years under Netanyahu. This is the first 2 paragraphs of this article. In the growing confrontation between the liberal world order and its anti-liberal nationalist and authoritarian opponents, which side does Israel want to be on? The question would have been absurd even a decade ago when Israelis still regarded themselves as members in good standing in the liberal world. But in recent years, Israelis a decidedly anti-liberal direction. Since about the middle of 2015, the Israeli government has embraced Hungary's avowedly, quote, illiberal, unquote, Prime Minister Viktor Orban, worked to forge close ties with Poland's ruling Law and Justice Party, despite its limitations on civil liberties and legislation outlawing public discussion of Poland's role in the Holocaust, warmly embraced Brazil's right-wing nationalist leader Jair Bolsonaro, provided a state visit for President Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines, who once likened himself to Adolf Hitler, worked consistently to woo Russian President Vladimir Putin, offered a 25-year contract to a Chinese state-owned firm to manage the port of Haifa, which has often hosted the U.S. Sixth Fleet, and provided consistently strong support for the military dictatorship in Egypt, including lobbying the U.S. Congress on its behalf, as well as supporting the authoritarian sheikdoms of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. And that goes back exactly to what we were talking about earlier with Seth Abramson and proof of conspiracy and things that someone like Robert Kagan, who's wringing his hands about, doesn't seem to be in too much of a hurry to get to the bottom of. Anyway, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu notably stood up for Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman following the October 2018 murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi journalist and post-contributing columnist. Okay, I do want to read a little more out of this article here. Let's see. Yoram Hazani, a conservative Israeli thinker and one-time aide to Netanyahu, has frankly proclaimed Israel's solidarity with those he calls the holdouts against universal liberalism in Hungary, Poland, France, Italy, Britain, and elsewhere. All face a struggle against what he calls the U.S.-led, quote, liberal. If you would go that far, there is broad agreement among Israeli conservatives that the central institutions order created since the end of World War II, the European Union and the United Nations, and perhaps even the transatlantic alliance NATO, are hostile toward Israel and should be taken down a peg. A united Europe, regarded by many on both sides of the accomplishments of the post-Cold War era, hasn't been a blessing for this country. Quote, hasn't been a blessing for this country, unquote. Michael Oren, former Israeli ambassador to the United States, has argued, quote, the less united Europe is, the better, unquote. And we quoted that article from Bloomberg, August 2018, with Michael Oren saying this, I believe, when we were discussing Hungary and it might have been when we were discussing the Orban-Andrew Vajna relationship.
Yeah, I think it was in the show that we actually did about the global grand collusion narrative.
Okay.
Yeah, I think.
The emerging nationalist forces in Europe have provided Israel new allies in its struggle with liberal Europe. Changes are happening in Europe, end quote, one senior Israeli diplomat told Haaretz a year ago. It is becoming less liberal and more nationalist. Hungary's Orban is leading this change, and that is why Net identified him as a key ally.
Did you say that's why Netanyahu identified him as a key ally?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. And so, I'm further in here. Kagan gets into how Israeli officials tried to broker a new start to relations between the U.S. and Putin, proposing a deal that would have dropped U.S. sanctions against Russia over its actions in Ukraine in return for Russian concessions to Israeli concerns about Iran's influence in Syria. But then, as in the rest of this 4-page article, Kagan gets into a lot of the history, the historical nature of what he believes is that it's been the U.S. and it's been the democratic West that has made Israel's survival and continued thriving as a global power a reality, and that moving away from this is ultimately bad for Israel. But once again, like I just said a few minutes ago when we were talking about this, when I was reading from this, why isn't Kagan trying to get to the bottom of the true nature of this global collusion? And honestly, I don't think he wants to, because it's pretty clear, like, if he wanted to get to the bottom of this, he could. I mean, he throws in there gems about Russia, about the Chinese port in Haifa and the importance of China gaining control of an important Israeli port, but he's not trying to get to the bottom of the true nature of what we're seeing, of what we believe we're seeing play out here. And so, while this is certainly obviously not, this is one of those examples of where you can find some truth mixed in with an obvious agenda, and obviously Kagan has an agenda that's not based on trying to tell truth for the right reasons, I don't believe, but you can get a sense and an understanding from one of the preeminent neocon, I guess you would call them paleo-neocon, but neocon nonetheless thinkers of our time, that, we're losing control of Israel to this right-wing, multipolar, global movement that is endangering much to bring so much good to the world since the end of World War II. And of course, I don't believe that that's the case, but this is from Kagan's perspective. This is what he's basically arguing. And I think that this is a validation of some of our theories that we've been laying out for a little while. And I go back to the article which first got me interested in this whole matter of questioning Russia's role in all intrigue, and it was from 2014 in the Jewish Telegraphic Agency on Ukraine. Israel and neoconservatives are not on the same page, and that was April 2014, and it goes into how Israel really didn't join in the opposition to the Russian actions in Crimea in March 2014, and it gets into the split between American neocons and Israelis, basically this class of neocons that people like Robert Kagan represent. April 10, 2014 on Ukraine, Israel and neoconservatives not on the same page. So I think this really when you listen to, I think when you do listen to the kinds of policy conversations that take place in the media and geopolitics, I think this is really a lot of it. I think this is at the center of a lot of what's going on here. And I also think that while there's clearly very high continuity at the highest levels, and as limited as these quote-unquote exposés like this one from Kagan is, it's still, I think, is very indicative that there is there's certainly, at the very least, a manufactured conflict of interest going on, and I think there's entities that are fighting for for power and control. And I think that this, certainly the rise of Russia and China and the lessening of American influence globally that I think is going on under Trump for a very specific, deliberate reason is considered a threat to people like Robert Kagan. Out that what's really at the root of a lot of Trump's quote unquote America first rhetoric and, quote unquote anti-war rhetoric. It's really not anti-war if you ask me, but anti-intervention rhetoric is not an actual freeing of America from militarism and all of this, but it's being done in a very specific reason. And I think it's being done to shift the balance of power globally. And I think Donald Trump is overseeing this. And I think that the right-wing elements in Israel that he has aligned himself with, as well as, is very much, in support of this. So I think that this really, validates a lot of, what we've been saying about about this neocon split and a lot of the intrigues of the geopolitics foreign policy community as it relates to the Trump presidency. And I think the bigger global picture, particularly as we look at Europe now.
Yes. Well, thank you for bringing this in and bringing this up, because it is very interesting that in a certain way, right, this is Robert Kagan's take as a limited hangout 11/9 truther, really, and it shows that just very similarly to those who are limited hangout 9/11 truthers, and they will only use a limited aspect of their interpretation or an acceptable interpretation of September 11th to push their political point, whether it's, from aspects even of the neocons and their specific, they've been against certain aspects of the Saudi relationship, even in certain domains at certain times, just like, the elements of the progressive left who will like to hang 9/11 on the Saudis and all of that. And that there's a limit to, they will not actually turn over the table. They will not viraja de mesa, as they might say in Brazil, on the actual 9/11 narrative. Similarly, the Robert Kagan paleo neoconservatives are going to only go so far in relationship to the resetting the table of the 11/9 Trump global Trump operation narrative. They are not going to turn over the table on 11/9, just like they will not turn over the table on 9/11. Of course, we'll see though. We'll see how far Robert Kagan's willing to go. Will he reference Seth Abramson's book Proof of Conspiracy, how Trump's international collusion is threatening American democracy? Probably not. Will he tell the truth about Israeli military intelligence's involvement in 9/11, even if it were the only option in saving potential American quote unquote democracy or even American hegemony? I sort of doubt that also. So it is an interesting question though, in terms of it really does lay out a real, I think it's real. I think it's an actual authentic difference. The question is it a difference that makes a difference, i.e. in the thread of information theory, like Claude Shannon, the definition of information was a difference that makes a difference. And I believe it might be. It very well might be that these paleo neoconservatives really are American firsters. That's what I was pointing out. It's sort of a strange scenario when you think about the way that Donald Trump was marketed, and where the Kagans are marketed as the quote unquote globalists, who the quote unquote America firsters, like Donald Trump allegedly are going to help solve. When it really comes down to it, when you think about it as actually like America first, as really sort of like an American imperial motto, it's really Robert Kagan here who's articulating an America first agenda versus the Donald Trump globalist collusion narrative.
A very twisted America first agenda, a very dark quote unquote America first agenda where, American military power is used to subvert and dominate and oppress people and mass murder people. But America first nonetheless. It's more America first than what, than what Trump is ostensibly
well,
promoting.
but that's what, I believe that that's what's built into America First as phraseology, is that there is it's not just like, yes, you serve the American people first. Of course you do. It's about actually first and foremost, meaning there's a sort of supremacist, an imperial mind state behind it. And I would say it's an anti-constitutionalist, anti-republic, American republic mind state that's built into the America First. But I do want to say that once again, it shows that these two sort of quote unquote choices that we're supposedly given of we have to call for a return to basically the American empire of some sort, or American quote unquote exceptionalism in the world, rather than the idea of American leadership based on principle and vision and innovation. Or we have to then choose these sort of like heavily Zionist, the multipolarism, really, that is sort of anti-liberal in some way, and thus it's against the American-led liberal order. So once again, I will identify myself as an American patriot of conscience, and that I'm a neither nor when it comes to this question, and that I would call myself a first principle patriot, and that I don't believe we have to accept either one of these choices. It's definitely, to me, neither Robert Kagan nor the Trump operation.
Exactly. Yes, and it's certainly not John Bolton, and maybe we'll talk more about that on when we record again, in some of the nature of the Bolton resignation and what he does and doesn't represent in relation to Trump. But I think we'll save that for another show, as we have had quite a marathon today.
Yes, at least we kept it under 3 hours, Greg. So that's good.
Yes. All right. Well, we'll be getting links up and sources in our show notes, and also we might try to, now that I'm saying this, I'll have to do it, break down some of these clips, maybe the last couple of segments, and we'll try to at least break a couple of these clips down into individual segments. So now that I've said it, I have to do it. So
there you go again, Greg. All right. Well, I enjoyed our conversation, and it was pretty wide-ranging.
Yes. I think we did a pretty good job staying too, which is one of our flaws. So.
All right. Until next time.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy.
All right. Thanks, Greg.